Chapter 1062. The Coldu Manor was shrouded in darkness. This was a villa with an obvious architectural style from the Year of Radiance. The architect who built it was Bolt, the most famous architect in the Empire 150 years ago. The villa's gorgeous curves were hidden in a sea of trees, and the railings on the outer wall extended 2 to 3 miles away. It was said that 2 dukes, a count, and the famous hostess Madame Belisa, lived here until she passed away. Now it was a private property of the royal family and had no owner. In the woods near the manor, there was a large rose bush and Brando and the others were hiding in the bushes. The dense leaves perfectly concealed their figures, and their aura was also concealed by magic. Brando observed the building under the night sky from afar. Just a few hours ago the witch of unknown origin had only told him one thing, and that was that the Coldu Manor was a trap set by the Silver Queen. Her target was neither Ina nor Sydney but himself. In this manner, the Queen did not order Countess Latch to guard, but the long-lost Scepter of Fire of the Empire. That was the part of Oderfeist's body that was divided into 3 parts. It was also the origin of the name, Scepter of Fire, a weapon of the Holy Cathedral of Fire. Brando couldn't help but look at his chest. Because of the fire orb in his body, as long as he got close to the scepter, Oderfeist's soul would naturally resonate with it, and thus be discovered by the other party. If what the woman said was true, then according to the initial plan, he would indeed suffer a loss tonight. He didn't think that Her Majesty would actually find this thing. He remembered the woman's words again. The real Countess Latch is imprisoned in Mulberry Castle, and is being guarded by the Scepter of Fire. And near the Coldu Manor, there is an ambush of the Flame Knight Regiment. But that woman was definitely not a witch of the Moon of Cup. Brando frowned. The witches' inheritors showed their talents from a young age. How could there be a new inheritor who was just a few decades old? This was simply not in line with the settings of the game. However, since the other party dared to swear to the 13th moon, at least it meant that she did not lie. At least until now, Brando had never seen a witch who dared to make such an oath casually. Most witches were good at deception. They often pretended to be the descendants of other moons, and then pointed to their own moon to make an oath. But this oath was nothing, because the witches were only responsible for the magic moon they inherited. However, swearing to the 13th moon was a completely different concept, unless a witch of the 14th moon appeared in this world. If that was the case, Brando could only admit that he was unlucky. At this moment, Vahina shifted her body beside him. She didn't feel that there was anything wrong with lying on the grass. Even though she was the princess of the Mehodafen family, she wasn't a pampered young lady. She had been to a dangerous place like the Loop of Trade Winds with Veronica before. Compared to that, this situation was child's play. It was just that the mosquitoes in the sky were a little unbearable. In the past, she had prepared all kinds of insect repellent and other alchemy potions to maintain her skin. Obviously, she didn't have the means to do so now. If you ask me, Vahina finally couldn't help but whisper, "Why don't we just attack Mulberry Castle? Didn't you say that the woman wasn't lying?" Naive. Even though she swore to the 13th moon, the truth can also lie. Before I know her intentions, I will never believe a witch's promise so easily. Brando recovered and explained to the noble lady, "Besides, even if we attack Mulberry Castle and fight with the Archbishop of the Flame Staff, we will still attract the attention of Her Majesty's subordinates. This is the imperial capital. Do you really think we can come and go as we please?" From what I can see, the imperial capital's defense is extremely weak today. Vahina pursed her lips. It's already a mess outside. Even the patrolling cavalry hasn't been dispatched. There are only a few of them. Brando furrowed his eyebrows. This was indeed a little strange. When he was outside, even he could see that the current atmosphere in the imperial capital was very strange. In this era, the nobles were extremely strict with the lower class, and it was not strange for the people to complain. There were riots in Aween all the time, but they were all extinguished as soon as they appeared. This was a world of magic, and those who had power often became the upper class of society. How could it be easy for the commoners to resist? This was why Grodin dared to act so unscrupulously in Abi's castle, and why Yuta and the other mercenaries dared not speak up. Only a freak from another world like him dared to challenge the old rules of this world. If Erewhon was like this in a small country, Cruz was even more so in the heart of a huge empire, the capital of the empire. Even though there were traces of the cultists behind the gathering of commoners, to be honest, the cultists were not worth mentioning in the eyes of the empire. All for one might be able to infiltrate the empire and the Holy Cathedral, but in a direct confrontation, 100 all for one might not even be a match for the empire. Could it be that Her Majesty has gathered all the power in the imperial capital just to deal with me? He could not help but have an absurd thought in his mind. But he immediately shook his head and threw the thought out of his mind. It was simply a fantasy. The imperial capital's defense system was roughly 4 layers. First, there were the city guards and the patrolling cavalry. Rushda's city guards and patrolling cavalry were about the standard of the Empire's second-line garrison, and their individual strength was around the peak of iron-ranked. These 2 armies were maintained at around 33,000 men all year round, and when mobilized they were a powerful force. Then he left the imperial capital and headed west. The White Corps was stationed in the southern part of the Wild Wolf Mountain Range to guard against the Nazar people. However, this legion had already been defeated by him in East Metz and was replaced by the Azure Legion. But because of Veronica, Her Majesty would never allow this legion to enter the Bengal region at this time of the year. The third line of defense was the Imperial Guard. The Imperial Guard was actually the Empire's 5th legion, and its strength was a level higher than the 4 major legions. This was because the basic officers of the Imperial Guard were composed of the Flame family knight, and the soldiers were the elites from the various legions. However, this legion guarded the palace all year round and was basically not used to maintain law and order in the imperial capital, so it was normal that they were not seen at this time. Finally, there were the core forces of the Empire, the Flame Family Knight Regiment, the Scepter of Fire, and the Silver Pegasus Knight Regiment. These were the core forces of the Empire, or rather, the Holy Cathedral of Fire. Originally, Brando thought that the Scepter of Fire had not been controlled by Her Majesty because this secret force had always been controlled by Vara. But from the unknown which, he knew that this powerful force had changed sides so quickly. The human heart was indeed fragile. Brando could not help but shake his head and sigh. In this way, with the addition of the Flame Family Knight Regiment and the Silver Pegasus Knight Regiment that were originally loyal to the Queen, the imperial capital was not impregnable at this time, but it was not something that ordinary people could shake. Historically, the cultists had instigated riots many times, but what was the result? It was just a riot. However, these people dared to do something under the nose of the Silver Queen. This was too arrogant. Logically speaking, the patrolling cavalry and the city guards should have been dispatched long ago. This was what puzzled Brando the most because the more the Queen's movements were unclear, the more he worried that the other party was hiding something. At this time, the Shire looked at the time, and the hour hand of the pocket watch was faintly pointing to the agreed time. "My lord." Brando nodded. Although the opponent's intentions were confusing, this had nothing to do with their operation tonight. What he wanted to do was beat them at their own game. If the woman's intention was to lure him to attack Mulberry Castle, then he would do the opposite and use the Cold Dew Manor as the battlefield. He did not expect to win in one battle, but at least he would make the other party flustered. Then he would arrange for others to find an opportunity to attack Mulberry Castle. And if the woman was telling the truth, then it would be even better. Since Her Majesty the Queen had chosen the Cold Dew Manor as the battlefield, then she must have a card up her sleeve and would definitely go all out. He would accept the challenge here and attract everyone's attention. Then that woman would have a better chance of saving Scarlet from Mulberry Castle. No matter what, this was a foolproof choice. Even if the worst happened, they would just go to Sacred Cantifer Palace and fight. This was something that they had prepared for a long time ago. Since they had prepared for the worst, there was no need to hesitate. Brando immediately used his authority as a planeswalker and summoned the Fireclaw Lizardman Lord Ropar. Space rippled and Ropar silently appeared beside him. In fact, he had already summoned this old subordinate back at the inn, but this fellow was too conspicuous and was not suitable for moving around outside. So he simply waited until they reached the Cold Dew Manor and then used his authority as a planeswalker to summon him. After all, the effect was about the same. Ropar was still the same as before. When he saw Brando, he first bowed. The Fireclaw Lizardman clan had a strict hierarchy, and the hierarchy was extremely strict. Furthermore, Ropar was the clan's warrior captain. Humility and loyalty to his leader had long been engraved in his bones. However, its vertical pupils still flashed with a glimmer of brilliance. The Fireclaw Lizardmen were a race of warriors. Battle was their life, and dying on the battlefield was the highest honor for a warrior. It had been a long time since it had been on the battlefield, and it had long been unbearable. "Hey old man," Brando looked at this old subordinate and couldn't help but laugh. "I understand that you can't wait to taste the blood of the enemy and the sweet taste of victory immediately, but you should also be aware of your current situation. I'll give you a task: protect this lady." At this moment, Ropar was no longer a creature card in the traditional sense, but a planeswalker card. Moreover, it represented Brando's original profession, a warrior. And of course, its strength had greatly decreased, and it obviously had no chance to participate in the upcoming battle. Brando knew very well what kind of enemy he would be facing next. The Flame Family Knight Regiment, the legend of the Holy Cathedral of Fire. Under the elemental awakening, there was almost no room for them to fight. A trace of regret appeared on Ropar's face, but he still bowed meticulously. He glanced at Vahina, and the latter was obviously sizing him up. It wasn't that she had never seen Ropar before, but she was a little curious about where he came from. Could it be that Brando was really a summoner? But he was clearly a sword saint. The daughter of the Flower Leaf leader wanted to say that she didn't need anyone to protect her, but she also understood that this was not the time for her to be willful. She could only nod to the Fireclaw Lizardman Lord as a sign of agreement. Fortunately, Ropar didn't care about the feelings of his protector. He was a warrior, not a knight protecting Her Royal Highness. In fact, Brando didn't want to summon Ropar so early. After all, the Planeswalker's authority was extremely precious. He originally wanted to wait and see what profession he needed before summoning. But now it was obvious that he didn't have the opportunity to be picky. In the face of the behemoth that was the Empire, even a little more power was a glimmer of hope. In fact, in addition to Ropar, he also summoned a few other cards to add to the deck of each profession. One of them was the Fire Giant, who had always been unlucky, and was assigned to Ropar, who had the same attribute. But probably because this guy was too unlucky, after being modified by the Planeswalker's rules, he actually changed from a creature card to a boundary card. Rage Outbreak Valor II Fire 10, Boundary, Aura, tap the target creature and clear all wrath counters. Deal damage to the target that is equal to the amount of wrath counters cleared. Maintain. Rage Outbreak is a permanent boundary. Endure the silence for a strike of vengeance. Rage counters were the special ability of Ropar's card. Every time Ropar was injured, he would accumulate a rage counter. He could accumulate a maximum of 10 counters. In other words, this card could deal up to 10 times the damage when it was dealt. The most important thing was that this card didn't have to be attached to Ropar himself. It could even be attached to the Planeswalker himself. With his current strength, he could deal 10 times the damage, and with the Berserk ability activated, even his teacher, Grey Sword Saint Mephistopheles, wouldn't be able to kill him head-on. It was a pity that it wasn't clear what the effect of tapping the card would be. Presumably, he would lose the ability to fight for a short period of time. If it could be maintained for 2 hours like other cards, then the side effect wouldn't be ordinary. Then there was the Platinum Angel. This card was quite memorable for Brando. Before he officially became a Planeswalker, this card was one of the strongest cards in his hand, but it was always out of reach. When it was finally unlocked at that time, Brando had already understood his own Planeswalker's rules, so he couldn't use this card for a while. Until today, when his deck had been greatly expanded due to the expansion of the Fire Elemental pool, he finally had the opportunity to convert this card into his deck. Originally, Brando thought that this card would eventually become a secondary card in Medusha or Hipamra's deck, but he didn't expect it to have a shocking reversal during the conversion process. It was directly assigned to Andrique in Mephistopheles' deck. Loyalty Eternal Death II Dark 30, Divine Artifact, Armor. The target of the pledge is not a Black Angel creature. Immediately return to the battlefield and obtain 5 battle counters. Indestructible Anti-All Protection ability. Even if the creature is removed from the battle or in the graveyard, this ability will still take effect. Maintain 1 stage. Loyalty is not limited by place and time, life or death. This card could be said to be a pain in the ass for Brando. This didn't mean that it wasn't strong enough. In fact, it could be regarded as one of the few powerful cards in Brando's hand. Unfortunately, its original card, the Platinum Angel, had a huge restriction on this card. It could only attach to non-Black Angel creatures. If this restriction was placed in the past, Brando still had the pristine Archangel card in his hand. But now, this card had been converted into the Avenging Angel in the Faith deck. This was a magic card, so naturally it couldn't be used to gain loyalty. Although he still had resources on hand and could create his own rules, he might not really be able to create an angel creature. Secondly, he still needed a powerful card to change the situation. For example, cards at the level of the Grimoire of Life or the Impasse Trojan Horse. It was impossible to invest limited resources into illusory hope. Moreover, with his Planeswalker level, it was still a problem what kind of creature he could create. He was afraid that the summon creature would at most be at the peak of the silver level or at most at the lower level of the gold level. Even if he added 5 battle counters and a series of abilities, it would just be an unkillable cockroach with no attack power at all. Therefore, the loyalty card was of little value to Brando for the time being. It belonged to the type that could be seen but not eaten. It was exactly the same as its original position in Brando's deck. For a moment, Brando couldn't help but be full of resentment towards the Platinum Angel card. She used to have this attribute before she was unlocked. He didn't expect her to still have this attribute after she was unlocked. You're just messing with me, aren't you? Because of this card, Brando didn't convert the last card in the end. First, he was afraid of encountering the same situation. It turned out that after the conversion, a creature card might not necessarily be a creature card, so he couldn't guarantee what the Grimoire of Life and the Impasse Trojan Horse could convert into. It was better to be safe and observe the situation before summoning. At least he would have something to remember. Just when Brando and Ropar were giving out tasks, the Shire closed the lid with a click, then reminded Brando, "My lord, it's time. Then let's go." Brando also immediately stopped talking, pulled out the Howran Gaia and ordered the others. The goal is to lure out the Flame Scepter and the Flame Family Knight. But before we meet up with Medisha and the others, try not to make too much of a commotion. Understood. The Shire, Andrique and Mephistopheles nodded together. Chapter 1063. There were 2 entrances to Frostdew Manor. According to Mephistopheles' investigation, each entrance was guarded by a small team of city guards. However, the manor's long borders and iron railings could only protect against ordinary people. Although there were a few patrols, they were all made up of city guards and had no defensive ability against elemental realm opponents. On Brando's side, Mephistopheles and Andrique had improved by leaps and bounds after the battle at the Evergreen Walkway. They had already reached the middle level of the elemental realm. The Shire, Medisha and Hippamera, who had been summoned earlier, had improved further and had the strength to reach the elemental enlightenment. With such strength, Brando did not even need to attack these ordinary people. He could directly pass through the garden in the middle of the courtyard. To these soldiers it was just a blur. When they looked back, there was no trace of him. They just thought it was an illusion. The main road in the middle of the courtyard led to the main entrance. There was a fountain in the square and there were 2 patrols here. They seemed to be more powerful than the city guards outside. Through their uniforms, Brando recognized that they were Rushta's Imperial Guards. However, in the garden on both sides of the fountain, there was a bush maze. Other than a few hidden sentries, there were no spies at all. And these few hidden sentries could not monitor the entire man-made maze. There was such an obvious loophole in the defense line, but these people ignored it. Seeing this, Brando couldn't help but believe the words of the witch of unknown origin. The Silver Queen was obviously inviting him into a trap, afraid that he would not be able to enter the central area of the manor. However, the other party had underestimated him. Even if the defenses were doubled, these people might not be able to stop him. Her Majesty the Queen was really petty. This trap seemed rather obvious, but Brando did not have any intention of retreating. He had originally come for this trap. If he was lucky, he might even be able to take away the bait in the trap and give the Silver Queen a surprise. Of course, even though they were going deep into the wolf's den, they couldn't be unprepared. They still had to plan their escape route. According to the plan, Brando took out a fist-sized gray crystal from the dimensional space and handed it to the Shire. The latter immediately cast a spell to wrap up the explosive crystal and threw it into the bushes. Next, the group continued to move forward under the cover of the bushes. Along the way they set up several explosive points. When they reached the last section where there was no cover, the Shire cast an invisibility barrier to cover everyone. Her Majesty deliberately let down her guard, which saved them a lot of trouble. Brando originally thought that they would have to waste at least a dozen spells here, so he specially prepared several types of MP potions for the Shire, just in case there was an awkward situation like not having enough mana in the game. Unexpectedly, the Shire had only cast a few spells so far, including the effortless guiding imprint that he had cast on the gray crystal. As a result, all his preparations had been rendered useless. However, this was a good thing for the battle that followed. When they arrived at the gate of the villa, the security here surprised Brando again. There was not a single wizard among the guards here. Although there was a small knowledge barrier on the door, this kind of thing was no different from a toy for the Shire, who had activated his elemental energy. In Wand, a wizard who had activated his elemental energy was called a Great Wizard, which was a very honorable title. It was much more difficult for a wizard to activate his elemental energy than a warrior. Other than the crazy Bugas, there were not many true great wizards even among the wizards of the tower. If the Shire returned to Karsuk with this identity, he could easily enter the upper ranks of the wizards of the tower and compete for the position of 7 heads. The power of a great wizard and an ordinary wizard were almost like heaven and earth. An ordinary wizard would have to spend a lot of effort to break this knowledge barrier, but for a great wizard, it was just a matter of raising his hand. Did the Silver Queen think that he did not even have a great wizard with him who had activated his elemental energy? In Brando's impression, the Silver Queen was not such a mediocre person. Obviously, the other party was afraid that he would back off, so she left enough loopholes in her defenses, so much so that in his opinion, it was a little too much. However, Brando also knew that some of the doubts at the moment were because he had been warned by the unknown witch in advance. If he did not know, perhaps he would be full of joy now that the villa's defenses were simple and crude. However, since Her Majesty the Queen was so generous, Brando also gave up the idea of directly teleporting into the villa through the power of the law. After all, every time he used a law point he would have less. The door of the villa was not closed all the time. There were maids and people dressed as housekeepers coming in and out from time to time, as if the villa was not heavily guarded by the Staff of Fire, but by Countess Wallach. These people gave Brando an opportunity. When the maids opened the door, they directly followed in. The Shire did not even cast any spells, and the so-called knowledge barrier did not react at all, as if it was blind. In fact, this was the effect of the Shire's elemental energy, the disassembly spell. This was the superior performance of the law of Spellbreaker. As long as he could identify the spell, he could disassemble the lines of law that supported the spell behind it. This was an extremely terrifying ability, directly turning the Shire into a real wizard killer. One must know that the law sorcerers were originally known as the enemy of the sorcerers. In addition to the disassembly spell, the Shire was basically in an invincible position in the battle of spellcasters of the same level or even those of a higher level. As soon as they entered the villa, the density of the defense suddenly decreased. This was logical. After all, according to the settings, the villa was where Scarlet lived. How could there be such a situation where there were sentries every few steps? Was this to guard against external enemies or to monitor the Countess? However, although the density of the defense decreased, the level of the defensive power increased by a lot. Brando found several hidden sentries of elemental rank and above in the dark. Listening to their unique breathing rhythm, Brando could distinguish the identity of the other party. He could not help but recognize it because the other party was an old acquaintance of his. It could even be said that the other party was his colleague, a Templar Knight. Brando himself was also an advanced Templar Knight, so he naturally knew the unique breathing rhythm of these people because they cultivated the blood of the scorching sun. He had to admit that Her Majesty the Queen's choice of these people as the internal defense force was a stroke of genius. If she used the Flame Knight as the armed force here, it would be too abrupt. After all, the Flame Knight was a secret force of the Holy Cathedral, and they rarely intervened in the affairs of the mortal world. However, if she continued to use the Royal Guards, Brando could not help but doubt the intelligence of Her Majesty the Queen. Avoiding the sight of the Templar Knight, Brando secretly caught the tongue of a maid. This detail made Brando secretly praise Her Majesty the Queen for being very good at setting up scams. Although the security outside was a little too deceitful. This maid obviously did not know the inside story. She was scared half to death by the sudden appearance of Brando and the others. Hendrik put a shiny curved sword on her white neck, and she almost fainted. After a series of questions and answers, Brando found out that the villa was divided into two areas. The maids could only move around the outer area, and Countess Latch lived in a few rooms in the central area of the villa. She almost never saw outsiders and only a few people, including Her Majesty the Queen, could see her. As for the others, they had never seen the Countess' face. This statement confirmed Brando's guess. There was no doubt that the person living in the villa was not Scarlet at all. He was almost certain that the flame scepter was placed in one of the rooms in the central area. As for the butlers mentioned by the maid, they should be knight captains in disguise. However, he did not know if they were Templar Knight captains or Flame Knight captains. The difference between the two was huge. The Shire used the sleep spell to make the maid fall into a dreamless sleep. He turned around and asked, "What do we do next?" "Naturally, we will act according to the original plan." Brando used elemental magic to project a simple map according to the information provided by the maid. This map lacked the environment of the central area, but the periphery was still relatively clear. He pointed to a few of the corridors and said to the Shire and the others, "We will act separately and enter the central area through these corridors. The target has been determined. After that, we will break out separately and meet outside the manor." The Shire immediately nodded to show that he understood. Although the main purpose of this battle was to attract the attention of the Queen, They did not intend to foolishly act according to the other party's arrangements. After all, this was the home ground that the Silver Queen had set up. It was obviously not wise to start a war with the Empire here. Brando had already decided that this time, he must make the Silver Queen go for wool and come home shorn. The Flame Scepter reacted to the soul of Odorfice, but the Shire and Mephistopheles did not have the Flame Pearl. His plan was to lure a few knight captains away and let the Shire and the others steal the Flame Scepter. Then they would meet outside the manor. This way, when Her Majesty reacted, she would not be able to decide the battlefield. Of course, there might be real masters guarding the room where the Flame Scepter was, but in the case of 3 against 1, even if the Shire was a supreme existence, they could still fight. The Shire, Mephistopheles and Andrique were not only planeswalkers, but also the Shire, Mephistopheles and Andrique, so Brando was very confident in them. After the task was assigned, the 3 of them immediately took the order and left. After the few of them left, Brando found that he was actually alone again. The state of a lone ranger was in line with his usual state in the game. After transmigrating to this world, he had not acted alone for a long time. In his memory, he seemed to have 2 subordinates by his side. If it was not the card creatures of the Planeswalkers, then it would be his senior, Nemesis and Roman. That's good. Otherwise, I would have forgotten my instinct to take risks. Brando shook his head and laughed at himself. Something seemed to have sprouted in his heart, and this long-lost feeling made his blood boil. This was the instinct to take risks. Although it had been dormant for a long time, it would never disappear. It could even be passed down from generation to generation. Once there was a chance, it would be awakened again. For a moment, Brando even had an illusion that he had returned to his heyday. Everything around him seemed to have returned to the dungeons and dungeons of the game era. Everything was under control. He walked towards the depths of the dark corridor. Although the maids in the villa could not see Scarlet, they more or less had to deal with the few housekeepers in the villa. According to the maid, a housekeeper named Shernan lived in the outermost room. Usually he was the one who gave the maids daily orders. Although there would be another housekeeper occasionally, most of the time, this person was in charge of the daily life of the manor. In addition, she also knew that the housekeepers liked to meet in a small living room on the first floor. According to the other servants, that was the housekeeper's lounge, and also a restricted area for the servants. Through this, Brando could already guess that this housekeeper named Shernan, or rather, the knight, was in charge of external affairs among the several knight captains. He might also be in charge of the outer defense. And that so-called lounge was probably the temporary command and alarm center of the knight. His target was the former. Brando did not guess wrong. The housekeeper Chernan's real name was Prydian. He was a great knight in the Flame Family Knight Order. His strength was below the level of the elemental truth. Because he was mainly in charge of logistics in the Knight Order, he was in charge of the daily operations of the manor in this mission. At the same time, he was also in charge of the outer defense of the entire manor. On this day, Prydian had been informed early that the long-awaited enemy might appear tonight, so he did not go to bed early as usual. As an ascetic knight, Prydian had a very regular schedule. Every night, he went to bed before the star of the Snake Queen rose, and he got up before the moon set the next day. He put his sword on the table, lit a candle, and sat quietly on a chair, waiting for the enemy to appear. As for the outer defense line, in fact, he had never paid attention to it. Because of Her Majesty the Queen's request, the outer defense line seemed to be full of loopholes in his opinion. It was better not to have it so that he would not be annoyed. Therefore, every day when the Templar Knight below came to report the daily patrolling situation to him, he simply turned a blind eye and did not hear it. It made no difference whether he heard it or not. But it was at this time that he suddenly felt that something was wrong. After the 13th breath of the 2 Templar Knight outside the door, a full 12 seconds had passed. Although people with improved physique could breathe longer than ordinary people, no one would hold their breath for no reason. Moreover, there were 2 of them. Prydian subconsciously reached for his sword, but before that, a dazzling black brilliance had already pierced through the void. It was the blade of the Haurang Gaia? P.S. After being reminded by a book friend, I found that there were 2 bugs in the front. One was the pristine Archangel. In Book 4, Act 55, it had been transformed into a magic card avenging angel, so there were some omissions in the description yesterday. The second one was in Book 5, Act 169. Brando had reached the peak of the elemental enlightenment after he was injured by White and was unconscious. I wrote 2 places wrongly as the peak of the elemental enlightenment. I am very sorry. Now these places have been corrected, but because of the intermittent updates in the middle of the amber, occasionally there will be problems with my memory of some of the previous details, resulting in bugs. So I hope that you can help me point out the bugs when you find them so that I can correct them. My QQ is 982407208. You can add me as a friend by stating that it is a bug in the book. Once again, I would like to thank Random Hero, Millennium Sealwort, and other enthusiastic book friends who helped me find the bugs, and those who helped me summarize the previous information. Thank you very much. Chapter 1064. As soon as Prydian moved, Brando immediately saw that his strength was above the elemental enlightenment. The Knight Captain of the Templar Knight was definitely not at this level, so his identity could only be that of a Flame Family Knight. The battle above elemental mastery was earth-shattering. Brando did not want to raise the manor to the ground now, so he knew that this battle could only be ended quickly before his opponent could react. It was a pity that a maid would not have the opportunity to know what elemental mastery her butler possessed. Otherwise this battle would be much simpler. Brando struck with all his strength as soon as he drew his sword, but almost all of his strength was bound to the sword, so it had little effect on the surrounding environment. In a battle between gold and silver ranks below elemental mastery, the airflow set off by the two combatants would often affect an area of dozens of meters. However, in a battle above elemental mastery, the battle was much more subtle. This was determined by the degree of control of the power. Of course, it was another concept for two elemental mastery to fight to the death. The range of the impact was absolutely unimaginable for gold and silver ranks. Although it was a little exaggerated to destroy dozens of miles with one strike, it was not a problem to destroy a few miles. Above the Supreme Realm, the battle was a different scene. Once the extreme planes began, it might not have any effect on the main material world, but it could also cause the earth to shatter. Faced with Brando's full-strength strike, Prydian instinctively fell to the side. Howran Gaia cut into the desk, cutting it in two like cutting tofu. A silver brilliance that was as fine as fish scales appeared on the surface of the desk. Then the whole desk seemed to be weathered into bits of gravel, disappearing into space. This was the lethality caused by multiple spatial oscillations. However, the Flame Family Knight sword, which could be considered a rather powerful magical weapon, was not annihilated by the spatial oscillations. Instead, it fell from the disappearing desk. Prydian thought that he had dodged the attack. He fell to the ground, twisted his body, and tried to grab his sword that had fallen from mid-air. However, he saw a scene that he would never forget in his life. He found himself sitting on the place where the desk had disappeared, and the dark blade in his opponent's hand was stabbing towards his chest. What was this? Forcefully changing karma? There was no such swordsmanship in this world. It could only be the power of elements. Prydian immediately understood that he was in big trouble. Any elements that involved time and cause and effect were definitely the top elements in this world. Fortunately, his elements were not simple. Since he couldn't escape, he would strike first. When Brendel saw the silver lines of law appearing around the Knight of Flames, he understood that the Knight of Flames was using elemental power. He immediately became vigilant. The Knight of Flames was not simple, and their elemental power must be extremely difficult to deal with. Moreover, even the most common elements were not easy to deal with. Without any warning, Brando saw his HP bar on his attribute panel suddenly drop by more than half. Then he felt his vision turn black, and a scorching pain spread throughout his body. Damn it, liquid gas phase change, Brando cursed in his heart. This person should be the inheritor of the Flame King's Falcon Knight. He didn't expect that he would be so unlucky as to encounter one of the most difficult inheritances in the Flaming Knights. It had to be said that the taste of this element was not high, and its ability was relatively simple, but its lethality was extremely high. Before the players found a way to restrain it, this element was once called an official cheat. A cloud of blood rose from Brando's body. It was his blood that had been evaporated. He endured the pain and pierced through the fog with his sword, stabbing towards the chest of the Flame Knight. "You're not dead?" The knight screamed, and then the blade of Howran Gaia pierced between his second and sixth ribs without any hindrance. Blood poured out, drowning his tongue and white teeth, and flowed down his chin like a waterfall. Blood dripped onto the carpet, and until his death, the Flame Knight stared at Brando with his eyes wide open, as if he had died with a grievance. Brando pulled out Howran Gaia, and the blood on the sword automatically gathered, forming blood beads, and then slid down the sword as if it had been waxed. However, this was actually a manifestation of the law of space. "Idiot, this element of yours would have been useful 30 years ago," Brando blurted out. Then he froze for a moment before remembering that this was not a game. In this era, this element could indeed be said to be invincible. It could only be said that this knight was too unlucky. Many players, including most of the elemental powerhouses of this era, like to distribute the lines of law in a range of 1 to 5 meters outside their body to resist the opponent's element power. This was also the most effective way to use the law. However, the law of liquid gas phase change worked from the inside to the outside. It evaporated blood from the inside of the body, so many players did not understand at first and thought that this element could penetrate the law defense. But in reality, the way to counter it was very simple. Just put a layer of lines of law on the heart. And this was exactly what Brando did. Even though I've never met an opponent who's at the liquid and gas phase transformation stage before, and I haven't even fought against laws a few times, the habits from my previous life are like an instinct, and I don't need to pay attention to them. As it turned out, this also saved his life. However, Brando suddenly thought that even if he did not do this, this guy would not be able to kill him, because he still had the galloping heart in his body. That thing was not affected by the law of liquid gas phase change. Everyone has their bad days, Brando sighed and covered the knight's eyelids with his hand, so rest in peace. He turned around and picked up the knight's sword that had fallen to the ground. The fact that this sword could remain unscathed under his spatial oscillation proved that it was not an ordinary sword. He opened the interface and, as expected, absolute death, gold attack, 27-33 plus 14 strength plus 22 dexterity additional skills. Words of eternal parting, kill the enemy when you damage him 3 times. Parting gift, it is Elvin's Lingu, a glass blade, so it is not enhanced by the character's own attributes. 5 swords were placed on the table, the tips of the swords facing each other, forming a radial shape. 5 knights sat opposite each other, red cloak, white armor. Unlike Prydian, the 5 knight captains knew that there would be a fierce battle tonight. They did not have to maintain the daily operations of the manor, so they put on their armor early. These armors were all blessed by the Holy Cathedral of Fire and forged by the hands of the most famous master craftsman, the best magic armor. The armor was imprinted with the pattern of golden flame, and each pattern was a spell that could be triggered immediately. If Prydian was also wearing his own knight armor, he might not have lost to Brando so easily. However, there were no ifs in reality. The knight's armor could only be worn after a series of rituals and prayers, and the wearer had to pray a day in advance. As the maintainer of the manor's daily operations, he had no choice. Suddenly, one of the knight abruptly raised his head, and like a chain reaction, his companions also looked at him one by one. The knight reached out his right hand, and there were 6 purple gems in his palm, one of which had been shattered into powder. Prydian is in trouble, should we sound the alarm? Then, is there any movement from the scepter of fire? The knight looked at the person who spoke. But everyone understood that there was no. So we can't sound the alarm, the knight ordered the others. There are intruders, you all go and provide support immediately, I'll stay here. The 4 knights immediately picked up their weapons and stood up to receive the order. As Brando expected, this was the temporary command post of the Knight of Flame, and it was also the alarm center. The alarm magic that was permanently stationed here could warn the Knight of Flame stationed outside. As long as the Scepter of Fire reacted, an inescapable net would immediately be launched outside the manor. As soon as the 4 knights left the place, the space in the hall fluctuated, and the Shire appeared in the ripples. The Knight of Flame, who was left behind, immediately noticed the intruder. He raised his hand, and the sword on the table fell directly into his hand as if it had a life of its own. Without any nonsense, the sword flashed and a dazzling brilliance crossed in front of the Shire. At the same time, the Knight of Flame rolled back and did not pursue. Instead, he pressed his hand on the red orb on the low table beside the sofa. He immediately noticed the strength of the other party. It was only the peak of elemental power. But the other party was a wizard. Wizards themselves were a rare group, and those who had the talent to reach the elemental mastery were even rarer. But there was no doubt that once they became an archmage, they would be the most difficult opponent to deal with. The Knight of Flame could not guarantee that he would be able to defeat the other party, so he had to complete his mission first. Unfortunately, when his hand landed heavily on the red pearl actually shattered into pieces under his astonished gaze, turning into crystal fragments on the ground. What's going on? He could hardly believe his eyes. Although the orb was not extremely sturdy, it was still a magic item. How could it break with a single hit? He subconsciously raised his head, but to his horror, he saw that the various magic arrays arranged on the ceiling, floor and walls in the room were rapidly losing their color. The mysterious runes written with magic ink turned gray, then turned into powder and rustled on the ground. Naturally, the power they originally carried naturally turned into ashes. It seemed that in just an instant, all the alarm systems in the villa had completely collapsed. After losing his last resort, the Knight of Flame calmed down and looked at the young wizard in front of him. He knew that the ones who set up these magic circles were the best court wizards in the empire. Among them there was no lack of truth elemental wizards. Even Grand Wizard Royale, who once taught the Silver Queen, had participated in the construction of this system. That was one of the only 3 Supreme-class adepts in the empire, the Supreme Mirror Adept. The young wizard in front of him was not simple. But he still had a chance to turn the tables. At this time, the Shire had already used a spell to eliminate the opponent's attack. He raised his hand and a silence barrier covered the entire hall. Of course, he knew what the other party was planning. The Knight of Flame wanted to use an earth-shattering battle to alarm everyone. But how could he give the other party this opportunity? Brendel inspected the sword in his hand, then sheathed it. He had tested it earlier and it was very weak. It was difficult to break through its defense. Even though the stats were frightening, he could not think of a way to use it at the moment. The only way seemed to be to use Haurangaya to break the defense first, and then use it to attack the wound. But it seemed to be unnecessary to deal with most of the enemies. This sword was especially useful when dealing with the big and high HP bosses. He first put the sword away. At this time, 5 minutes had passed. The Knight of Flame must have some kind of connection with each other. Otherwise, wouldn't it be impossible for him to defeat them one by one? He did not believe that with the strength of the Empire, they would not give the Knight of Flame such a small thing. What he needed to do was to delay the follow-up support and help the Shire, Mephistopheles and Andrique as much as possible. The candlelight in the room flickered. Brando's eyelids also twitched. He felt the spatial thread he extended tremble 4 times in a row. For people. Brando's heart sank. In his imagination, the best situation was for him to face 3 people. The Shire, Mephistopheles and Andrique would deal with the remaining 2. He did not expect the other party to think so highly of him that they would come out in full force. This was not going to be fun. The other party was a Knight of Flame, the successor of 120 Knights of the Flame King. Their combat experience and standard far exceeded that of the average elemental realm expert, and they often had extremely difficult elemental realms to deal with, just like the guy he had killed before. Although the other party died in an extremely aggrieved manner, it was because he had the advantage of foresight. If it had been an ordinary person, they would have died immediately under the liquid and gas phase transformation. The Knight of Flame had neglected this point, which was why he was killed by him. If it was a normal confrontation, although Brando had absolute confidence in winning, it was not possible to kill him in one move. In addition, the Knight of Flame should also have his own exclusive armor. With the buff of this armor, the increase in his combat strength would not be just 1 or 2 levels. Brando immediately realized that this battle could not be fought like this. Otherwise, even if he won, it would be a Pyrrhic victory. There were more enemies outside, how could he waste his energy here? He took a step back, and the power of a few hundred energy rank instantly exploded. The wall behind him collapsed under his impact. Behind the wall was a small hall, and there were a few maids busy in it. They were obviously frightened by Brando's sudden appearance. They screamed, then turned and ran. Brando did not even look at them. He was already prepared to be discovered. After all, it was impossible to fight with 4 Knight of Flame without alerting anyone. At this time, the alarm magic in the villa should have lost its effect. Even if these maids notified the people outside, it would take at least 10 to 15 minutes for the Empire to react. In other words, this was the time they had left. It was basically enough. The Shire, I'll give you 12 minutes. After 12 minutes, whether you succeed or not, you must retreat immediately. Understood, Sir Lord. On the other end of the telepathic connection, Charles and the others immediately responded. Chapter 1065. Brando took a step back, but before he could regain his footing, a cold light flashed in the dust fog formed by the collapse of the wall in front of him. 2 long swords pierced through the flying dust towards him. Before the tip of the sword reached his face, a scorching hot aura rushed towards him. A golden flame was reflected in the depths of Brendel's eyes, and he actually saw a fire bird flapping its wings and flying out from behind the dust cloud, heading straight for him. At the same time, the floor beside him roared, and the bricks below broke out of the ground and stacked on top of each other, instantly forming a concave wall that surrounded him. Fire of life, elemental earth. This was the inheritance of the Blue Knight Carmen and the Earth Knight Devereaux. However, forcing him to fight them head-on, Brando thought that the other party was really thinking too much. They probably thought that he killed their colleagues by means of a sneak attack. In that case, it would be good to teach them a painful lesson. Just as he was about to draw his sword, a thought flashed through his mind, and he abruptly stopped his sword. The crystal implanted in his right arm made cracking sounds, almost shattering because it could not withstand the power of the feedback. Brando had a new idea at this moment. These battle instincts were like instincts engraved in his bones. He raised his sword, and with two clangs the two swords were forced back. Every time he blocked a sword, a phantom stepped out, following the trajectory of Brando's sword to pursue the flame knight in front of him. Brando's figure flashed and appeared directly outside the earth wall. He rolled on the ground, seemingly very embarrassed to avoid the firebird that flew towards him. 9 luminary sword art? A muffled scream came from the fog. He was recognized. Brando was slightly surprised but soon calmed down. After all, the Flame Knight was not an ordinary person. They had inherited the ancient memory and inheritance of battle skills. It was not surprising that they could recognize the sword skills of the War of the Holy Saints. At the same time, the loyal Flame Knight also saw that Brendel had the space element. The space element was one of the best abilities to use in a sneak attack, not to mention that he had mastered the 9 luminary sword art, which allowed him to appear and disappear unpredictably. When he rolled backwards, it meant that he was only strong on the outside but weak on the inside, and did not have the strength to fight 2 people at once. Stop him, don't let him run away. As soon as the knight's voice fell, Brando heard footsteps behind him. He looked back and saw 2 flame knights appear outside the door. This was the reason why he chose to do this before. The enemy in the light was always easier to deal with than the enemy in the dark. If he had shown too much strength at the beginning, these 2 flame knights would not have appeared so easily. They would not talk about knight spirit. They would definitely hide in the dark and wait for an opportunity to sneak attack. But the flame knight present did not know that Brando's previous 2 swords were not more than 30% of his strength. Although he was only at the peak of the elemental enlightenment and had not crossed a level compared to these flame knights, his explosive power had always been far superior to ordinary people because of his equipment, skills, and element enhancement. Not to mention, at this moment, Brando was very insidious in suppressing his strength to the level of the elemental enlightenment. This level of strength was very deceiving. It was not only a level higher than these flame knights, but also not enough to make these knights feel threatened. The key was that it was even more deceiving. This also sowed the root of the following misfortune for the knight. Brando pretended to be desperate and swung Haoran Gaia at the 2 knights behind him. The 2 flame knights thought that he was going to kill his way out, so they cooperated tacitly and attacked without saying a word. Silver lines of law appeared around the 2 flame knights. One of them had a layer of bloody light on his sword, while the other had a domain similar to the extreme plane. This domain was like a space without light at all. It was endless darkness. This was the fantasy element, the inheritance of the Dark Knight. Brando was in this domain and could not help but secretly rejoice. Fortunately, he had lured these 2 people out. One had a bloody light and the other was dark. 2 fantasy elements. If they really attacked him in the dark, it would be really difficult to deal with. But now it was different. The Haoran Gaia in Brando's hand suddenly showed a ferocious face. The surging power was amplified by the crystal, and the law of space on the sword also burst out in an instant. The peak power of the elemental enlightenment was undoubtedly revealed at this moment. The 2 flame knights' faces showed surprise at the same time. They realized that they had been fooled and subconsciously wanted to retreat. Brando's piercing strike formed an invisible ripple in front of them. The 2 flame knight raised the swords in their hands and tried to block it, but the explosive power stacked more than 10 times directly made the swords in their hands break inch by inch like fragile glass. They could even see the law of magic on the sword distort under the pressure of space, then collapse, turning into countless lines of law dissipating in the air. Then the power spread to their bodies. The armor of praise shone brightly and it also cracked. But before that, the 2 flame knight flew out like cannonballs, accompanied by a rumbling sound. Who knows how many walls were knocked down. The destructive power of this blow was so great that a corner of the villa completely collapsed. The smoke and dust in the air became thicker, almost to the point where one could not see their fingers in front of them. But Brando knew that these 2 people were not completely dead, because there was no kill notification in his battle record. The armor of praise blessed by the Holy Temple was indeed worthy of its reputation. Ordinary low-level elemental enlightenment had no possibility of surviving after taking a full blow from him. His power completely shocked the remaining 2 flame knight. This was not the level of the peak of the elemental enlightenment. Even the peak of the law was not so terrifying. The 2 could not help but think of the scene when they faced another man decades ago. That man was called Mephisto. In the face of Brando's terrifying power, the 2 flame knight could not help but hesitate for a moment. But Brando did not have time to be in a daze with them. Although the 2 flame knights that he killed were not dead, they should have lost their ability to fight. Since he had nothing to worry about, he did not hesitate to activate the element of space. His body flashed and his body flashed out of the corridor. Damn it! The 2 flame knight finally reacted. A layer of light appeared on their armor of praise, and 2 spells, Angel's Speed and Heaven's Strength, were cast. Then they chased after him, one in front and one behind. In Wound, every element was subdivided into many levels, and the element of space was no exception. From the lowest level of teleportation ability to the highest level of spacetime ability, each level of law had a different degree of freedom. For Brando, who had mastered the highest level of element of space, teleporting to the outside of the manor was not a problem at all. But he still strictly controlled the distance between him and the 2 flame knights behind him. In fact, even so, he did not use his element of space most of the time, and from time to time he had to pretend that he was blocked by the earth element that the 2 flame knights controlled to form a stone wall. Only then would he have the opportunity to stop and fight with the 2 flame knights. Just like that, Brando attracted the attention of the 2 flame knights. While fighting, he approached the outer area of the manor. At this time, the battle in the manor had already alerted the people outside, and the maids had already fled. So, the few corridors were empty, and the 2 parties did not have to be cautious. After the 2 flame knights stopped looking down on Brando, they cooperated with each other and avoided a direct confrontation with him. Brando knew very well that the 2 flame knights were stalling for time, but this was what he wanted. So, the 2 sides fought all the way to the outside of the manor. Here, the palace guards who had discovered the abnormality in the manor were already on standby. They surrounded the building with 3 layers of guards. But when Brando saw these people, he could not help but shake his head. He suddenly raised his sword high and drew a crimson sword light from the sword blade to the sword tip. The sword light diagonally cut the ground, along with the wooden floor and half of the wall in the corridor, into 2 halves. In the midst of the wood chips flying, the 2 flame knights did not dare to fight head-on. They retreated again and again, feeling a chill in their hearts. What kind of power was this? It was at this moment that Brendel sheathed his sword and turned around to face the incoming Imperial Guards. He put down the Haurang Gaia in his hand, and his body's center of gravity slightly moved forward. A huge force passed through his right foot to the ground, and his whole body shot out like an arrow towards the palace guards. The 2 flame knights didn't even have time to react. In fact, they did not want to react at all. They stopped and watched as Brando's whole body turned into a flash of silver light. This silver light pierced straight into the palace guard's formation, and then flashed forward again. A wave of blood was set off. There was only one voice left in the minds of the 2 flame family knights: the sword skill of the Flame King, Flash Strike Sword Art. Where Brando's sword passed, a vacuum area was plowed between the palace guard's formation. There was only blood flowing on the white stone floor. When he stopped, he was already in the middle of the army. He looked around coldly, and the palace guards coming from all directions were reflected in his eyes. In the forest around the manor, there were already faint figures. The red cloaks were bright and dazzling, and the white armor was neat and uniform. It seemed that the battle in the villa had alerted the flame knights that were lying in ambush outside. I have to enter the next stage. He was about to contact the Shire and the others to prepare to retreat, but the planeswalker's telepathic voice sounded first. Sir, we succeeded. Brando was happy and waved his hand. In the next moment, the Shire, Mephistopheles and Andrique appeared beside Brando. The planeswalker's authority was Brando's biggest reliance. How are you? Are you hurt? Not bad. Our luck is not bad. There is indeed a supreme class expert below, the Shire replied. Willick, you should know this person. So it was him. Brando suddenly understood. This person was the former commander of the palace guards. He was different from the current Pallet family's idiot who relied on the queen's favor to get to his position. He and another palace sword saint were known as the twin jade annulus of St. Constantine Palace. They were both supreme class experts of the Empire's royal family. The Shire then calmly explained the course of the operation, as if they were not under siege at the moment, but still in the Cat and Beard Inn. It turned out that after they got rid of the remaining flame knights, it did not take them much effort to find the room where the Scepter of Fire was. The one waiting there was Willick. Fortunately, Mephistopheles' element played an unexpected role in the battle. His element was called the Silver Moon, which was similar to the Grey Realm and the Dark World's fantasy element. This type of element had a huge characteristic, which was that it could establish its own realm below the supreme class and pull the opponent into a space similar to the extreme planes. This realm was naturally not the real extreme planes, and it would not cut off the connection between people and the material world. However, Willick did not expect that it would be able to fool him and prevent him from acting rashly. This bought the Shire precious time to display the magic refraction card. The magic refraction card in the Card of Fate was not only used against the magic of the material world, but also all abilities and supernatural abilities. Willick's swordsmanship was naturally included. As a result, the former commander of the palace guards took a full blow from Willick and was flustered. This first move determined many things. Taking advantage of this opportunity, Andrique decisively broke the seal on the Scepter of Fire's defense and took it in her hand. Then they were summoned. The whole process was flawless. Perhaps the Sword Saint had not realized what had happened until now. "Well done," Brando praised. "Now that we have the prize in advance, it's time to get down to business." Hearing this, Charles looked back and noticed the environment. The Flame family knights came out from the forest in all directions, and almost surrounded all directions. If they were not close to the periphery of the manor at this moment, they would be in the center of the ambush at this time. He could not help but secretly praise his lord's foresight. "Are we going to make a move, my lord?" Brando nodded. The gray crystal that was previously placed in the manor immediately detonated. In a dazzling roar, the historical and cultural relics of the Empire were completely turned into ashes. Brando even saw the fountain at the main entrance of the manor being lifted up by the expanding surface and flying into the sky. But since the Silver Queen did not care about this, Brando had no reason to feel sorry for Cruz. The Imperial Guards and city guards in the manor were suddenly unlucky. Not only did they suffer heavy casualties in the explosion, but they were also blocked by the sea of fire that followed. The Flame family knight regiment who arrived later had to stop, so a huge gap suddenly appeared in the originally complete encirclement. P.S. As for the problem that some readers have mentioned about the Shire's elements, I will explain it later. It is not a BUG. Also today Warship N finally opened a 5-to-5 event, so it took half an hour to clear the stage from 5-to-3 to 5-to-5. In the end, the Royal Yacht Lady announced the end of the mission with a single shot. Recently, I happened to see several articles about the Black Warship N in the 3DM and other places. Some people don't make games properly and only have these despicable methods left. That's why it's said that despicable people have their own despicable ways. Chapter 1066. The night in the capital was not going to be a peaceful one. While Brando was sneaking into the Cold Dew Manor, another battle was taking place in the Tundra Castle. The commander of the attacking side was a delicate little girl, but her battle prowess and tactical prowess were enough to strike fear into the hearts of the city guards. Medicia stood alone on the suspension bridge of the castle. The battle was almost over, but the air was still filled with the smell of gunpowder. She held a silver spear in her hand, and a winged helmet protected her slightly childish face. Under her resolute silver gaze, the gate of the Moss Castle was already wide open, and the enemies who had tried to stop her were lying in the hole of the gate, lifeless. This was part of Brando's plan, and it was just one of the many scenarios. After a while, the vanguard of the White City finally took down the last tower. The Nightsong Tiger poked half of his body out and waved at her. Medicia nodded in satisfaction. "Well done, uncle." "It's all thanks to you, Miss Commander," the Nightsong Tiger replied with a smile. The members of the mercenaries of Lopez had changed their weapons. The leader of the mercenaries, the Nightsong Tiger, was clad in heavy armor, and his weapon had been changed to a long halberd. There was a line of words engraved on the blade of the halberd, and it was actually a saying passed down in the countryside of White City: "Courage gives victory." The inside of the tower was a mess. The corpses of 7 or 8 Imperial soldiers were scattered around a table and a window. There were also a few broken bows scattered around, and the small space was filled with the thick smell of blood. The Nightsong Tiger looked at the scene and shook his head calmly. He took out his pipe and lit it with a match. The darkness flickered, and a cloud of smoke rose into the air. It was a moment of peace after the battle. The men were still immersed in the aftertaste of the massacre. The smoke seemed to form an illusion, and behind it was the mythical Hall of Gold, the home of the warriors and the Temple of Valor. Falerne frowned and pulled her sister out of the building, causing a wave of laughter. There were a few people hiding in the shadows of the city walls who wanted to sneak attack the two sisters. However, Falerne's hand flashed with a cold light, and half of the wall was covered in a layer of frost. The few Imperial soldiers were also frozen into ice cubes. The level of the mercenaries of Lopez summoned by the White City Vanguard card was only 10 levels lower than the Felon Knight. Now that Medicia had touched the enlightenment of truth, the strength of the original mercenaries of Lopez naturally rose as well. They all activated their elemental activation and became holy knights. Inside the castle, the remaining city guards were defending the castle's main gate. Hippamera, her iron golems and gargoyles' attacks were thwarted time and time again. In a fit of anger, Miss Priestess went into action herself. She raised the mountain hammer and slammed it on the gate. The gate, which had been reinforced by the wizards behind the gate many times, was undamaged. However, after a series of tremors, the entire wall of the castle collapsed. Almost everyone was stunned by this shocking attack, but Miss Priestess did not feel anything. After all, it was fine as long as she achieved her goal. Hippamera pushed the gate open, covering her nose with her hand and coughing violently. The wizards and soldiers behind the gate had long been killed by the tremors, and only the frame of the gate was left standing in the flying dust. With one wall down, the moss castle looked like a gaping black mouth, and the gate was its erect front teeth. The gate creaked as it was pushed open, and the bricks behind it fell like rain. At this time, Hippamera suddenly felt a sense of danger. She raised her right hand, and a ring of light spread out from her finger, forming a hemispherical curtain of light. Song of Blessing. A giant axe swung out from the darkness, followed by the sound of the wind. The axe landed heavily on Hippamera's curtain of light, but the curtain of light did not even ripple. It only flashed slightly and then disappeared into nothingness. The shockwave of the explosion directly smashed the gate on both sides, and the frame of the gate broke with a loud bang. The two gates slowly fell down one after the other. Suddenly, a fist reached out from the darkness and smashed the gate into pieces. Wood chips fluttered in the air like butterflies, and then fell down one after another. Then a bare-chested man walked out from the darkness, holding a giant axe upside down. The man's pants and leggings looked like he was not a city guard, but a knight of the Imperial Guard. He looked at Hippamera, who was unscathed, and looked at her with surprise. Even the corner of her clothes did not move, and asked, "What is this ability of yours? How can a mere peak of the elemental enlightenment block my attack unscathed?" "This is the Song of Blessing," Hippamera answered seriously. "It is the faith that the goddess gave to me. It is indestructible like a mountain and like the heavy earth." "Is that so?" The man chuckled and raised his axe. "Then I would like to see how firm your faith in your goddess is." Facing the opponent's attack, Hippamera immediately became serious. Although she was a little naive, she was not stupid. The opponent was obviously a supreme class power, and even with the help of the mountain and river, she could not win. She had to find a way to hold on until Medisha and the others arrived to help. Just as the man was about to attack, he suddenly took a step back. With a soft clang, an arrow burning with pale white flames was embedded in the place where he was originally standing. The place was originally a marble floor, but the arrow was not only firmly embedded in the ground, but the tail feathers were still shaking. It was enough to show how powerful the arrow was. The burly man raised his head and saw that 3 women had appeared in the sky at some point. Or rather, female creatures. They looked more like 3 sets of female armor riding on white Pegasi. The Pegasi rode on the wind and stood in the air, while under the women's armor white flames rose and rolled, forming into human bodies. Under the winged helmets, the eyes were especially bright like a pair of stars. They held longbows woven from moonlight, and the arrows on the bowstrings were made from white flames of the underworld. They aimed at the man from above. "Valkyrie?" The man was shocked. This was a legendary existence, and he never dreamed that he would see one here. "Very well," the burly man's eyes glowed brightly as he raised his axe. "I've heard that the Valkyrie are true warriors, that they live for battle, that their every action is based on their instincts for battle. Today, let me see what the so-called instincts of a warrior is." He was full of fighting spirit and was about to attack when he heard a voice behind him. "Stop, Talir. You're the captain of the Knight's Guard. Don't you find it embarrassing to show off in front of a little girl?" The burly man was slightly startled. He turned his head and saw a person walking out from the shadows of the hall. His long green hair was particularly dazzling in the darkness. His calm eyes contained a vast amount of wisdom, and they were as clear as jade. "Veronica?" He then saw the others standing behind the female captain. The master of the Mehodafen Principality, the head of the Kirk family, the Grand Duke of Flowerleaf and his eldest son, the elder of the Royal Council, Gerd, Grand Duke Freeland of the Whalen family, Duke Cecil, and, it was an old man with a hunched back, but his aura was still as dignified as the empire itself. When he saw this old man, he almost instinctively knelt down on one knee to greet him. During the era of Grand Emperor Grantodi, some people said that the Grand Emperor represented the will of the empire, but there was only one person who represented the empire's dignity, and that was the Prime Minister, Nydivan. Although he had left the political scene for many years, one could still see the glory of the era when the empire's power was at its peak. He did not need to speak. He was already a living legend. Some people hated him. They were the nobles under the holy cathedral of fire who had lost power in the power struggle. Some people respected him. They were the veterans of the empire who had witnessed an era and witnessed their glorious soldiers. Although the captain of the Night Brigade, Teriel, was not promoted by him, but in the era of Prime Minister Nidevan, he was only a captain at the lowest level. He had long heard of this great man's illustrious reputation. He did not dare to speak to the old Prime Minister, so he could only ask Veronica. "Veronica, are you planning to leave?" "Leaving this place means betraying Her Majesty the Queen," Veronica sighed. "But now I have no choice, Teriel." "These people outside. What is their relationship with you?" The captain of the Night Brigade frowned and questioned. "These people are not from the Empire. I saw at least Fanzin, elves and bugle war machines among them." "Don't worry, Teriel," Veronica replied. "We will not betray the Empire to outsiders. As for these little guys outside," at this point she could not help but smile. Who would have thought that fate was so strange? She and that little guy named Erwin had only met once in the loop of trade winds, and even had a hostile relationship. But because of her kindness, she did not expect that one day she would really be benefited from this appreciation. Although she knew the purpose of Brando's visit to the Empire, in her heart, she still felt that she owed him a great favor. This little guy who likes to cause trouble is getting into more and more trouble. She could not help but sigh in her heart. "Very well, I respect your choice." The captain of the Night Brigade raised the axe in his hand. "Lady Veronica, but if you want to leave this place you have to ask my old friend first." "Are you serious?" Veronica could not help but shake her head. "Teriel? Of course, can't you see the burning fighting spirit in my chest?" "Is that so?" At this time a cold voice suddenly interrupted, as expected of the Empire's courage. "Then you should be ready." At this time the captain of the Night Brigade saw another person beside Veronica, and he could not help but widen his eyes. Saint Sydney? The last person to walk out was the statue of the Lion Palace's saintess. She looked at the captain of the Night Brigade with a cold face and replied, "I am the one who led these people here and now I am taking them away. Do you have any objections, Teriel?" "Aye." The captain of the Night Brigade looked as if he had seen a ghost. "What, do you want to ask your old friend as well?" "No, of course not," the captain of the Night Brigade coughed. "I suddenly remembered something." At this time, he knew that the Moss Castle must have a secret passage. This kind of secret was not a secret to people like Sydney and Vala who had once stood at the top of the Empire. "What did you think of? Is there another lady from the capital waiting for you?" "What? Where did the burning desire in your chest go?" Sydney asked unreasonably. The captain of the Night Brigade had a bitter expression on his face. He could not help but ask Veronica for help, but she ignored him and dealt with it as if nothing had happened. He had no choice but to beg, "Please let me go, teacher." "Very well, I have no intention of making things difficult for you. You may leave," Sydney replied. The burly man hurriedly bowed to the old chancellor as if he had been pardoned. He then carried his axe and hurried out of the ruins. Facing this scene, the people present couldn't help but laugh, but they didn't have any strange expressions. Who didn't know that this guard commander was once a proud student of the Lion Palace's saintess? "Lady Sydney," the Duke of Flowerleaf finally spoke, "please convey my gratitude to your friend from Aween. The House of Kirk owes him a favor." Jared and Duke Freeland also expressed their opinions. With them taking the lead, the other nobles who were rescued also joined in. Only Duke Cecil remained silent. Of course, this was not because he had a grudge against Brando for killing his son. It was because House Cecil had always been a vassal of the Holy Cathedral. Sydney had already told him privately about the relationship between Brando and the Holy Cathedral, so it did not matter if he expressed his opinion or not. However, the noble statements were basically meaningless to the saintess of the Leo Palace. It was only when the eldest son of the Duke of Flowerleaf asked if his sister had arrived at the imperial capital that the saintess reacted a little and nodded. She then turned to Veronica and said, "Mr. Brando is currently attracting the attention of the Silver Queen at Frostdew Manor. He is no match for Her Majesty alone. Come with me to support him." "No problem," Veronica quickly replied. She did not wish to see Erwin's son get hurt because of her. "Bring me along, I will go too." At this moment an old voice suddenly sounded. Everyone turned around in shock to look at the old Prime Minister who had spoken. "Her Majesty's mistake is not the fault of one person," Nidwin slowly said. "All of us should be responsible for this." Take me to see her. I will persuade her to show mercy to your little friend. Veronica looked at Sydney with uncertainty. The latter slowly nodded. What about the others? Continue to act according to Mr. Brando's original plan. Sydney turned to Hippamera standing outside and said, Miss Hippamera, please send these people to the west of Rustle. At this point she suddenly stopped talking. Rustle, 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 rustle. The ground trembled slightly, and the gravel in the ruins seemed to come alive. It was as if magic had been injected into it. This is earthquake? That was the first thought in everyone's mind. They immediately rejected the idea. The entire castle was shaking, and the air was emitting a whimpering sound. It was as if something was shaking. Wave after wave, clear ripples appeared in the entire space. Some small pebbles floated up from the ground and floated into the air. The entire hall seemed to have lost a part of its gravity. The stone pillars creaked and broke from the middle. The scattered pebbles also floated up and floated in the air. Veronica's expression changed. Hippamera also felt that something was stirring up in the other world. The change of the laws had caused such a huge reaction in the prime material plane. What kind of earth-shaking change was happening on the other side of the world? What was it that was calling? Sydney suddenly raised her right hand. Everyone saw the right hand of the sacred lady of the Leo Palace. From her wrist to her elbow, a golden rune lit up repeatedly, and finally formed a mysterious pattern. This is, P.S. Many thanks to Shangheng for helping me organize the deck. This one saw it. It was very well made and very useful to me. Thank you. I have to say that although this one is lazy and often breaks chapters, the readers have always been very helpful. This makes me very touched. Chapter 1067. A quarter of an hour ago in the Cold Dew Manor. The flames from the explosion lit up the entire hill, illuminating the forest around the manor. Amidst the flames, the Imperial Guards were either dead or injured. Brando leaped over the manor's iron fence and landed in the forest. The siblings followed closely behind and landed safely on the ground. Seal flew behind them in the air, and when he left the manor, he threw out a force field wave behind him. The invisible force field wave that was 1,000 meters wide shot out from his hand and crushed the outer walls of the manor into pieces as soon as it touched them. The iron fences on the outer walls curled up and broke, making ear-piercing screeches. The solid ground below also formed layers of ripples under the force of the huge force. The soil was unable to withstand the surface tension and instantly cracked open a few holes that were dozens of meters wide, blocking the city guard patrols that were chasing after them. After entering the forest, Lin Sanjiu could see the lights of the Crown District clearly through the shadows of the trees. Only a river separated the Tessellate District from the Count Chef District. However, it was not an easy journey. As soon as Brando landed, he saw more than 10 flame knights emerging from the forest. The leader had a white wolf's mane on his shoulder. He was the successor of the wolf knight Hillman. The wolf's mane on his shoulder was one of Hillman's spoils of war from the Battle of Homan Valley. However, the original had long been lost when the 13th knight died. The one in front of Lin Sanji was a fake and not even the first generations. The wolf knight's element was bloodlust. Once they saw blood, their combat power would increase exponentially. Hillman's successor naturally inherited this element. He was full of confidence as he strode forward and swung his sword. In his opinion, his opponent was only at the pinnacle of the truth realm. As long as the battle lasted for a while, he would be able to hold his own. Not to mention he had several companions behind him. This was the first time in the history of the Flaming Knights that they had mobilized so many people. Nearly half of the 140 Flaming Knights were lying in ambush here. This plan was filled with unparalleled pride and confidence. No one would think that there was anyone in this world who could fight against half of the Flaming Knights. The Flame Knight swung his sword at the Haurangaya. What a fast sword, he thought. This person must be at least a sword saint. However, the person suddenly took a step back and left an afterimage on the spot to block the Flame Knight's sword. Then the person raised his sword and stabbed at the Flame Knight. It was an ordinary strike, but it was enough to make the Flame Knight's successor tremble in fear. This strike was called Nine Luminary Sword Art. With the Wolf Knight's successor as the center, Brando moved 3 times in a row and attacked with his sword 3 times in a row. Every time he took a step away from his original position, he would leave an afterimage and attack from different angles with different sword skills. The 4 afterimages and Brando's original body attacked almost at the same time. The Hillman's successor tried his best to block 3 of the attacks, and his sword pierced through the throat of one of the afterimages. But at the same time a cold light flashed and his head flew high into the air. The severed neck flashed with blood, and an arrow of blood shot up to the sky. Brando's eyes were as cold as water, and his tense face was full of blood. He casually pushed the headless body of the hillman's successor into a tree, and his expression didn't change at all. He continued to face the next Flame Knight. The Flame Knight behind him was stunned. This wasn't to say that the knight's mental fortitude was too weak. In fact, with 1,000 years of memories, every Flame Knight had a fighting instinct and experience that ordinary people couldn't hope to reach. Not to mention, these knights who were able to inherit the Flame's blessing were the best of the best in this era. In the era of the War of the Holy Saints, the Flame King Gretel's knights had experienced the most tragic battles. Those who were able to survive were all used to life and death. The death of their companions and enemies didn't cause any waves in their hearts. Even in the most bizarre situations, they were still able to maintain the necessary calmness. But in the end it was already 1,000 years later. The experience of the Flame Knight of this era made it difficult for them to reach the level of the first generation of Flame Knights. They had unparalleled fighting experience, but they didn't have the coldness to see through life and death. Therefore, the knight was only stunned for a moment. By the time he reacted, the demon-like Brando had already appeared in front of him, bathed in blood. Only then did the knight realize that he had made a fatal mistake. He made the correct decision at the last moment, raising his sword to meet the enemy. But Brando only took a step forward, and the heavy black blade of Haurangaya was like the tip of the spear, piercing through the knight along with his sword. The knight's heart was filled with regret before the world fell into darkness. But regret couldn't change his fate. The second one caused everyone present to be stunned for a moment. Was this really the battle of the Flame Knight? Brando continued to move forward. His next opponent was a middle-aged man with a thin face. He was quite handsome, and the white feathers on his cloak proved that he was a knight captain. Brando immediately recognized this person. It was Steve the Flawless Spear. The Flame Knight only had 7 knight captains and none of them were unknown. The man in front of him had the strength of the law, and was on par with Veronica during the Battle of the Loop of Trade Winds. He was one of the 7 strongest knight captains of the Flame King, and his elemental Indestructible was a rare elemental that didn't have an active effect. He was immune to 90% of damage. There were also 2 great knights beside him. They were the inheritors of the Dragon Knight Samuel and the Light Knight Robin, and their strength was also at the peak of the elemental enlightenment. Obviously, the knight present also realized that Brando was difficult to deal with. The knight whose strength was lower than that of the elemental enlightenment went around him and faced the Shire and the vampire twins. At this moment, the Shire was facing an earth elemental and a fantasy elemental, and Mephistopheles and Andrique's opponents were 3 people led by the heir of the Steel Knight. In the face of this scene, Brando knew that he had to end the battle quickly. Although the Flame Knight who came from other directions were temporarily blocked, they were not the Praetorian Guard and should catch up soon. He stretched out his left hand, and another sword appeared in his hand. Absolute death. The Flame Knight screamed angrily, and then realized that their colleagues in the manor might have been killed. For a moment they were angry and disdainful. They were disdainful that Brando dared to use this sword in front of them, but they knew the flaws of this sword very well. Steve's heart was also full of anger. Prydian was a newcomer that he thought highly of. He raised the long famous spear in his hand. In his heart he had already sentenced Brando to death. Although Her Majesty the Queen wanted them to stay alive, that was to say as long as they did not die. At this moment, Brando did not care what his opponent thought. He took out absolute death not to anger the other party, but to frost soil. With his low roar, a glacier appeared out of thin air, and sharp icicles burst out in all directions, like an ice waterfall, instantly covering the space of nearly a kilometer. The biting cold wind mixed with the power of the elements came, and even Steve did not dare to face it head-on. He and several Flame Knight immediately flew into the air, but there were still 2 people who were hit by the crisscrossing icicles and crashed into the forest with the rushing glacier. Wherever they passed, the trees withered and withered, the branches and leaves turned into white frost, and then broke in the middle. Steve punched the icicles that stabbed towards him, turning them into dust. Then he finally saw Brando hiding between the crisscrossing icicles, and stabbed at him with his spear. At the same time, several Flame Knights, including the 2 great knights who had avoided the icicles' attack, also attacked Brando at the same time. But at that moment, Brando suddenly raised his head, and Steve saw a desperate fanaticism in his eyes. For some reason, at that moment, his heart was suddenly full of vigilance. This kind of vigilance was the same as the moment of life and death he experienced in the Holy War. It was the fear of the signs of death. He was very confident in his hunch, and suddenly the alarm bell in his heart rang. "Retreat, retreat quickly," he shouted, but he could not stop the attack, and the sin in his hand had already hit the opponent without hesitation. Together with the 4 long swords, the long spear stabbed at the opponent's body. Brando was only wearing a count's coat, and the coat was easily cut open, revealing a golden-gray breastplate underneath. The defensive power of the breastplate was beyond imagination, and the bright blade of the sin could not do anything to it. A silver light bounced off the breastplate and finally pierced into Brando's shoulder blade. But the spear did not penetrate the body as Steve imagined. The defensive power of the opponent's body was also terrifying. He felt as if he had hit a metal stone, and that feeling was exactly the same as when he fought with several of the top Templar knights. In fact, it was even better. He looked back and his eyes almost popped out. The long swords of the other flame knights could not even get close to Brando's body. A layer of indistinct radiance blocked their blades, causing sparks to fly in all directions as if they had struck a wall of metal and stone when they were only a foot away. Conflict Halo. The faces of the several knights were aghast. This guy was a Templar knight. However, the most troublesome ability of a Templar knight was not their conflict halo, but their crown of thorns and blood of the sun. The few flame knights almost immediately realized that they were in big trouble. At this moment, a white brilliance suddenly burst out from Brando's body. The brilliance was like the vines of a rose, and it bounced towards all the people who had attacked him. Although Brando's defensive power resisted almost all the damage, the refraction of the blood of the sun was not calculated in this way. Even the attribute of the Gate of Law of the Lonia Gap had restored Steve's attack, which was reduced to elemental truth. However, it was so unreasonable, several flame knights screamed. Only Steve was slightly better. The indestructible element minimized the damage he suffered. But the warning in his heart did not go away because it was Brando's turn to attack. Brando extended the Haurang Gaya to these people. Cold wind. At that moment, time could be said to pass very slowly because it was almost static. For those who faced such a scene, it was like an eternity. But it could also be said to be very fast because in the eyes of the onlookers, it was a breath's time. They saw a biting cold wind blow out from behind Brando. What kind of wind was that? It was like a blade plowing through everything in its path. Trees and rocks were all turned into ice crystals, and in the blink of an eye, they were shattered into pieces, flying all over the sky. But this was only the beginning. Then it grew so strong that it could not be described with words. It only made people think of the legendary, immortal world spiral on the mountain where the storm stopped. That was the perfect storm that occupied the entire wind elemental plane. It was not wind, but a sword of divine judgment. It hit the top of the mountain where the Frost Dew Manor was located. Everyone witnessed this unforgettable scene with their own eyes. The entire mountain swelled up and then shattered with a bang. Rocks and trees flew into the air, and the mountain seemed to fall apart, turning into dust. The flow of earth and rocks poured down like a landslide. Even after nearly half a minute, smaller stones and gravel rustled down from the air. This was the power of a supreme realm. Brando raised his head in shock. In the darkness of the night, he saw that half of the Frost Dew Manor that was located halfway up the mountain had already completely disappeared. A terrifying hole had appeared in the background of the mountain. The layer of earth above it had long since vanished, revealing the pale and jagged luster of the rocks. After the hole appeared, a full moon shone on the entire forest. What was going on? He remembered that he had activated Frenzy and used the full power of the Frost Soil Guard. Although the combination of frost soil and cold wind was powerful, it was not to this extent. Saber's full power attack was only this much. "My lord, are you all right?" Mephistopheles had just finished off an opponent and turned back to ask with concern in midair. Brando shook his head. He felt that there were layers of illusions in front of him. He saw the reflection of the white tower in the sky and the spiral peak. Hundreds of millions of lines of law converged into a silver-white plane, and the seed of light was born in the lake of the abyss. He saw the rebirth of the elemental border. The shallow sea was like a dream, the storm stopped, the mountain stood in the clouds, and under the dark stone pivot, the scorching river flowed. These illusions were repeated over and over again, but there seemed to be a voice in his heart. "I was born in the flames." At this moment he actually felt that his realm of truth was faintly loosening, and the door that blocked his final path was opened at this moment. He was not the only one who felt this. Everyone present felt the same shock. Everyone turned around involuntarily. Steve also got up shakily from afar and looked at Brendel in disbelief. The power of a supreme realm was not enough to kill the commander of the Flaming Knights in one blow, not to mention that the other party had the undying elemental power. Of course, even so, he was seriously injured, and the knight of the Flame family who fought side by side with him had long been reduced to ashes. The peak of the law. This young Count Tonagel was only in his early 20s this year. It was hard not to think of another person who also reached the top of the White Tower at the age of 20. About 1070 years ago, he had a laurel crown called the Flame King. But at this moment Brando's mind was no longer on this. Because he knew he was in trouble. It was at this moment, 5 vast and unparalleled pressures fell from mid-air, and Brando immediately felt that he was locked in by several forces. His body felt heavy as if he was shackled. The Shire, Mephistopheles and Andrique, who were fighting with the Knight of the Flame family in mid-air, groaned and fell directly from the sky, landing heavily on the ground. Brando looked up and saw that in the starry night sky, there seemed to be several bright constellations. Those were the titles that he was familiar with or had heard of. Their names had shined in history for a time, and they were the peak of the power that the players once worshipped and yearned for. That was the head of the Knight of the Flame family, the Empire's Gate, Richard. The strongest wizard of the Empire 70 years ago, the Lord of the Mirror Realm, the Lightless Return, Royer, and his lifelong rival, the wizard who was close to God, the tower-defying Saipan. There was also the strongest of the 11 Holy See besides Vara and Sidney, the sword-bearer, Bradley. Finally there was Willick, one of the Empire's twin paragons 60 years ago, the Lion Sword Saint. 5 Supreme Realms. Nearly half of the Empire's 13 Supreme Realms were here. The power in the sky was as deep as the abyss. P.S. I wrote the last chapter late. I was afraid that it would disturb my thoughts, so I didn't take the time to write the article. Because it involved a small climax, this chapter took me 6 to 7 hours to write, and countless brain cells died. Also, there was a small problem with the Duke of Flowerleaf. My hand slipped. The Duke of Flowerleaf is Vahina's grandfather, and his eldest son is Vahina's father. I'm also drunk. I'll change it later. Chapter 1068. Brando smiled bitterly. In his original plan he should not have made such a big move, but he did not expect the power of the law in his body to explode on its own, opening the door to the peak of the law in the middle of the battle. In the eyes of others, this was an unimaginable benefit. Many people were stuck in front of this door for their entire lives. Every time they advanced in the elemental realm, it was an unattainable and precious opportunity. Only true geniuses could walk to the end of this path. Even his teacher, Grey Sword Saint Mephistopheles, was a once-in-a-century genius, had been wandering in front of the door of the extreme planes for decades. But at this moment Brando could not appreciate it. The reason was because of the 5 suffocating mountains in front of him. In fact, he had been fooling around in order not to attract the attention of the power of the extreme planes, but he did not expect to fail at the last moment. When he accidentally revealed this level of power, the Silver Queen immediately attacked. But now it was almost a quarter of an hour earlier than he had expected. 5 of the extreme planes, 2 against Mephisto, 2 against Sidney, and it seemed that the Silver Queen had specially prepared one for him. Brando could not help but think that Her Majesty really thought highly of him. Then he forcefully suppressed the restless seed of law in his body. Once he stepped over the edge of truth, there would be a tinder of law left in his elemental domain. And when he reached the ultimate realm, this tinder of law would form his personal domain, the ultimate plane. This seed of fire was also known as the first light of the wand, because the sage wanted to obtain true wisdom from this light. This was the origin of the Pale poem, where all things were born from water, obtained spirit from light and gained wisdom from fire. But at this moment, Brando did not dare to accept this seed of law, because with a strong enemy in front of him, he did not dare to rashly break through the realm. But what made him extremely distressed was that this seed of law was unusually active, thousands of times more active than the seed of law that was born in the game. He felt as if something was forming a resonance with it, and it immediately took root and sprouted. He did not know if this was an inevitable reaction of the power of existence, or if he was special. But if this continued, it would be difficult for him to concentrate on the upcoming battle, which was undoubtedly a big problem. Fortunately, the 5 Lemeters did not immediately attack. Brando raised his head and looked at them. He knew that these people represented the Queen's will, and the Silver Queen was most likely watching everything that was happening from somewhere. She didn't let them attack because she still had something to say. Sure enough, an instant later, a voice descended upon the Frost Dew Manor. A descendant of Darius. The Silver Queen's voice was surprisingly young, almost like that of a teenage girl. Brando was stunned for a moment before he remembered that her age was permanently fixed at 15. However, this voice was filled with an inhuman coldness, as if it was implying that its owner was temperamental. In the manor and the surrounding forest, everyone raised their heads. The city guards, imperial guards, and Knight of Flame all knelt down on one knee, placing their left hand on their chest to show their utmost respect to the owner of this voice. When your grandfather was still alive, Erwin and the Empire were the closest allies. That was also Erwin's most glorious era, and the world called it the Anson Revival. But what about your current actions? You've repeatedly obstructed the Empire, and you even intend to support the separatists of the Empire. You've disappointed me. Brando, you've also brought shame to your grandfather. The Silver Queen's voice paused for a moment. According to the Empire's laws, your death is not to be regretted, but Darius and I are old friends. The Earth Sword Saint was once the commander of the Temple Alliance, and the Empire owes him a favor. So I'm giving you a chance. Submit to me, or die. Brando felt the pressure on him lessen and he couldn't help but grind his teeth. It didn't feel good to be controlled by someone else, even though the other party was a famous figure in history, and there was nothing embarrassing about being suppressed by them. He raised his head and his voice resounded throughout the forest. Your Majesty, when the Flame King established the Holy Cathedral, he also established Cruz. The countries under the Holy Cathedral have always regarded the Empire as the spokesperson of the Holy Cathedral. And Erwin is the same. In fact, just before you closed this door, Erwin's envoys and I had already arrived in Lone. Since you've never lacked Erwin's loyalty, you naturally won't lack the loyalty of a mere count from a remote place like me. But now, Brando asked loudly, is it the Silver Queen of Cruz, the Emperor of the Holy Cathedral and the Empire who commands my loyalty, or is it the Dark Dragon of Mardos who commands my loyalty? Brando's answer was loud and clear. There was silence both inside and outside the manor, causing everyone to look up at the sky. Even the Knight of Flame's family wanted to know where their honor and pride came from. Was it the inheritor of the Flame King's bloodline and beliefs? Or was it a reformer who revolutionized the world and corrected the mistakes of the past? But were the people of Cruz really qualified to inherit the honor of the people of Myrna? Other than the Silver Queen, probably no one could answer this question. Her Majesty herself was silent for a moment. She stood by her desk and looked at Brando on the crystal ball with a calm expression. It was almost the same face, the same stubbornness, and she could still vaguely see that person's past glory between his eyebrows. But what she saw on this face was not only the impression that belonged to Darius, but also everything that she had lost. Those things that only lingered in the deepest part of her memory belonged to the past. You have also received Odin's inheritance and fate, and you should understand everything that I have seen. In that case you should understand who is right and who is wrong. What good is it for us to maintain the lies of the wise ones? To maintain this false peace? She shook her head. I have heard this too many times. The Bugas are like this, the dragons are like this, the silver elves are like this, and in the future that I have seen, our world is so fragile that maintaining the status quo will not help us defeat the dusk. The wind blew from the other side of the mountains, and the forest that had been ravaged by the flames of war made a soft rustling sound. This moment of silence seemed to be telling something in everyone's hearts. What Her Majesty saw on the battlefield of the final battle was indeed the threat of the dusk. Brando understood. At that moment he felt a voice whispering something in his heart, but when he listened to it, it was illusory and unfathomable. It was like a whisper in the wind. It sighed softly. Mardos had been gone for so long, and 1,000 years ago, the last ruler of the Empire made such a choice. The Silver Queen waited for his answer. Brando was silent for a moment before he spoke again. Your Majesty, you are supreme. On your throne, a single decision of yours can affect the fates of countless people. Your Majesty, countless people live because of you and countless people may die because of you. It all depends on your decision. I have no intention of changing your will, but I just want to say that there are many paths in this world, and not all of them lead to hatred. The wind and sand ruffled the canopy, and Brando had some kind of understanding in his heart. He seemed to hear the voice that lingered in the forest like a ghost. It sighed. 1,000 years ago His Majesty the Emperor chose to end hatred. So he was called the Fool. Andrique, who was lying on the ground, suddenly had a look of astonishment in her eyes. She took out the scepter of fire, and circles of golden fire patterns on the scepter lit up. The air was filled with unease, and some unknown factor behind the law world was stirring restlessly. At that moment, the wind in the forest began to grow stronger. That's why Mardos failed, the Queen replied coldly. Those beautiful lies are the cancer that spreads in this world, and when you listen to its sweet words, a bleeding dagger has already been plunged deep into your heart. Brando shook his head. Your Majesty, Mardos did not perish because of Odin's choice alone, and the reason he made such a decision was because he could not see any hope. That empire of the past could not save this world. But 1,000 years, could it really erase hatred? The Silver Queen sneered. Odin made such a choice, and what was the result? 1,000 years ago he chose to end everything, and 1,000 years later civilization is still trapped by hatred. What did the so-called wise ones bring us? The conquest of the 4 empires? The canopy of the forest near the manor danced wildly, and the knight in the forest looked at the sudden gust of wind with some doubt. Summer had long disappeared. Could it be that there was still a rainstorm at this time of the year? Of the 5 supreme class, only Saipan the tower rebel turned his head slightly, as if looking for something in the void, and then frowned. Brando was also in the midst of this gust, his long hair flying, and he looked up at the Silver Queen. But at least the 4 wise ones ended the harsh rule of the Myurnas, Your Majesty. The Silver Queen sneered, as if mocking Brando's naivety. Harsh rule will not destroy this world, but dusk will. Do you still not understand? There is not much time left for this world, and short-sighted people cannot see the dangers of the future. If we leave them alone, we will only be waiting for destruction. I am saving them, but what you've done has only put more people in trouble, Your Majesty. The Silver Queen did not think much of it. Naturally, in order to return to the path of the past, there will be countless people who will shed blood and sacrifice, but it will all be worth it. Because of the mistakes we made back then, we must pay the price now. You find it hard to understand? Her voice was somewhat contemptuous. Descendant of Darius, you should understand that everyone in this world does not exist alone. You said that the fate of the people of the empire will change because of my decision, but how can I and my people not come to this point today because of the decisions of our predecessors? And it is precisely because everyone has to pay the price for the decisions of others that our civilization can be established. Brando looked at the sky silently, looking at the unpredictable flowing clouds under the night sky. At this moment, a string in his heart faintly touched. Many figures and things appeared in front of him, as if he saw all the past history that Odorphis had once let him see, as well as the illusions that existed in history. He saw the arrogance of the empire. At this moment, the 2 empires were overlapping with each other. The wind carried the scattered leaves into the night sky. They gathered together in a frenzy, like a torrent in the sky. Brando suddenly understood something. My lord. At this moment, Andrique suddenly shouted. He turned around. In the sky, the Silver Queen changed her tone at the same time. She shouted condescendingly. Descendant of Darius. The manor you are now in is called Frostdew. It was built 150 years ago and has had several owners, but the one who lived here for the longest time was Madame Belisa. That woman likes this place because in this manner, she can overlook the entire capital of the empire. When all living beings are beneath her feet, she sees those who are at the bottom of the empire. Do you understand? Those who have been tormented by disasters, pain, war, and all sorts of other reasons, but they do not understand where their sorrow comes from, so they often feel unbearable pain. And us, known as nobles or rulers, we can clearly see our own weakness, see how fate has left a deep mark on us, but because of this, we also feel pain and sorrow. But no matter how the twin goddesses manipulate the threads of fate, no matter how suffocating this world is, no matter how deep the pain is, we will still silently move forward. That is why the empire and civilization will move forward step by step. And this is our resistance, the true meaning of the path of golden flames. Do you understand? If we abandon those who cannot keep up with our footsteps, or let them indulge in illusory self-consolation and escape, or even if we choose to escape from everything that we cannot choose, then what will happen to this world? The Queen's voice became cold and sharp. When you choose to be alone, you have already betrayed everyone. The nobles' so-called aloofness and detachment is actually just a betrayal of their own class. What I see is no nobility, only indifference and selfishness. And the tragedy of Mardos stems from the fact that the nobles of the Myurnas chose to escape at the last moment. Odin abandoned their faith, causing the blood of the previous generations to flow in vain. So he is the fool. The forest fell into silence, only the sound of the wind sweeping across the mountains and rivers could be heard. The knights seemed to have fallen into deep thought. They put down the swords in their hands with a thoughtful look in their eyes. Queen Gao Yongrong's voice spoke to them. That's why, lone knights. The people of Cruz will not collapse because of the loss of a faith. On the contrary, it is because my people are proud enough that they can face their mistakes head-on. And the descendants of Darius, a speck of dust cannot hide the glory of history. Wiping it away will only make the empire more brilliant. The Silver Queen's voice resounded throughout the sky. So, my empire, my people, do you understand your glory? You, because you stand on the side of the truth, glory, the brilliance in the eyes of the people lit up. Only for a moment, all the imperial soldiers present raised the long swords in their hands high. But in the sky, Richard and Royer suddenly frowned. The restless factor in the air was becoming manic. But Her Majesty the Queen did not let them take action, so they could only wait quietly. Brendel looked on coldly from the sidelines. For some reason he suddenly felt a little distracted. In this fanatical atmosphere, he saw the wind in the forest slowly calm down. And the voice of the Silver Queen also quieted down. The three cheers of the night also quieted down. Brando? Endrique shouted again. She felt that the scepter of fire in her hand was trembling slightly. But this time Brando did not seem to hear it. He raised his head. He already had his answer in his heart. Perhaps you are right, Your Majesty, he said, but there is a problem. You are full of confidence that you have changed everyone's fate, but what if you are wrong? The Silver Queen fell silent. Time seemed to have stopped at this moment. Ridiculous. Her voice was full of disdain and sarcasm. The sages used the fall of an empire and 1,000 years to prove this result. How can I be wrong? How can I be wrong? Brando's heart was clear. Arrogance was born in people's hearts, but people often did not notice it. They thought that they were born noble and could stand above everyone else. The Myrnas of Mardos perished here, and today history repeated the same mistake, closely linking the fate of the two empires. Brando felt as if he was in a world of silence. But there was a voice in his heart that was becoming clearer and more definite. It was the majestic pulse from the long river of fate. It gathered countless times, countless fates, and countless voices. It only gathered into one word: fight. Fanatical blood flowed in his body, roaring, rushing, and screaming, but his heart was extremely calm. He quietly looked at all the strange scenes in front of him. His gaze seemed to pass through the shackles of time for a moment. He saw the Mardos being destroyed in the flames. He saw the Cruz Empire being born from the flames. The replacement of the old with the new did not come from a hero giving his people victory. It was the intertwining of countless people's fates. Everyone threw themselves into it and wrote an epic with flames. So the empire was born. It did not record the legend of heroes, but the struggle that belonged to everyone. Countless individuals gathered to form the vision of history. Brando's gaze met them one by one in the long river of fate. He was so shocked in his heart that he could not control himself. This was a glorious hymn, but it did not belong to one person, nor did it belong to a sage. Even an insignificant individual like him was in the middle of it all. And at this moment, Brando finally understood in his heart why he was resisted by the flaming blade. He gently shook his head and laughed bitterly. I used to think that I never thought of myself as a hero, but I didn't expect that there was such a yearning hidden in my heart. Oderfeis, thank you for letting me recognize my arrogance. A voice immediately responded to him in his heart. The voice was full of kindness. But suddenly another voice sounded, and it overshadowed the previous voice. Arrogance is the ambition of a young man. Heroism is the romance of a man. This is not something to be ashamed of. This voice was spoken by a man with a rich magnetic voice. Brando turned around and was stunned to see a person walking out from beside him. It was a tall man with a red cloak burning behind him like a flame. His long hair shone like pure gold, and his eyes were as blue as the purest sea. He held a long sword. The sword was engraved with golden flames, and there were small words inscribed on it: Mats Visitarsi, flame hammer forged fate. It was the holy sword Oderfeis. The man patted him on the shoulder and smiled at him. Go ahead, I'm with you. P.S. Begging for monthly votes. Chapter 1069. The knight raised the swords in their hands and the three cheers suddenly stopped. Because everyone felt an inexplicable throbbing in their hearts. They turned their heads one by one, and what they saw was a world of stillness. The wind was still and every leaf was drooping. There was no sound of wind or insects, and moonlight poured down from the branches, creating a silver brilliance. It was quiet and secluded. Everything in the world fell into silence, as if the world had calmed down, meekly and silently crawling. On the sea of magic, the 12 moons were dim, and there was not a single ripple on the surface of the sea. It was like a mirror reflecting the color of the sky. Brendel opened his eyes, and his pupils were clear and limpid. But at that moment, everyone felt that the laws were deviating, leaving them in fear. It was as if something was descending, and its unstoppable power was dominating and taking over everything. The knight instinctively looked down and found that there were snakes and insects of all colors under their feet. Countless insects were fleeing from the grass, and the pebbles on the ground were spinning strangely and trembling. Some small grains of sand even floated up and flew into the sky. Among the 5 Lameters, the sword-bearer Bradley finally noticed something strange. The air was filled with a familiar holiness, as if he was in the sacred hall of the Holy Cathedral of Fire. The sacred image of a sage stood on top of it, watching everyone with a profound gaze. It was also watching him. This is... Behind the crystal ball, the Silver Queen did not notice these minute changes. She only watched Brando, waiting for the young man's answer. After a moment of silence, Brando spoke. Your Majesty, you and I do not know what the future will be like. But my dream is actually very simple. How Rangaya and Absolute Death both disappeared without a trace in his hands. He crossed his hands and gently pressed them down. Although there was nothing in his hands, everyone felt that there was a sword tip resting on the ground. Dong, everyone felt their hearts skip a beat. A ripple spread out on the sea of magic, spreading in all directions. At this moment, all the adepts in the Banker region had their connection with the world of laws forcibly severed. In the hundreds of temples of various sizes throughout the region, the evening prayers of the monks echoed in the prayer halls as usual. But the bishops in gorgeous robes opened their eyes in horror as they realized that there was no response from the territory of Tiamat from that moment on. The bell of the holy temple tolled. Countless people woke up from their dreams, drenched in cold sweat. Their dreams seemed to have been swallowed up, and Bunasan, the country of dreams, was closing its doors. At this moment, the witches discovered that the country of witches had disappeared, and they fell into a common nightmare. In the endless darkness, they saw a golden sword burning with raging flames descending from the clouds. It was like a sun illuminating the entire sky. Rustle, 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 the entire world began to shake. In the Valva Prince district, the gathered citizens saw the statue of the Flame King trembling slightly. The sand on the ground rose and fell as if forming a layer of waves. The windows of the surrounding buildings creaked and shattered one after another, and the sound of glass falling to the ground could be heard all over the place. Screams of horror rang out in the square and some people began to hide. It was inevitable that there would be chaos. Is it an earthquake? Seti held Arl's hand tightly, feeling the low rumble under their feet. Arl shook his head firmly. He frowned and carefully protected Seti from the jostling crowd. The sage is angry. Someone in the crowd screamed. There was a commotion. The believers in the center of the square who were holding a ceremony stopped and looked up at the same time, looking in a certain direction. In St. Cantifer's palace, the Silver Queen seemed to have finally noticed the abnormality outside. She frowned and turned to the person behind her. Grim, go out and take a look. The Dragon Queen nodded expressionlessly, turned around and opened the door to the inner hall, disappearing outside. Then the Silver Queen turned around. Her face was as calm as water, and her silver eyes reflected the brilliance of the crystal ball as if there was another world inside. There was indeed another world behind the crystal ball. Because in Brando's dark brown eyes, there seemed to be a dazzling golden flame burning in the depths of his eyes. He opened his mouth and his voice seemed to shake the whole world. I don't care what you want and I don't care who you are. Her Majesty the Supreme Queen, or the Dark Dragon of the Myrna people. But, give Scarlet back to me. The buzzing in the air was the change of the law. Oh no. At this time, Bradley finally realized what was making him feel uneasy. He immediately unsheathed his sword and roared, "Stop him!" But it was not up to him. Give Scarlet back to me. His thunderous voice reverberated throughout the entire forest. The low rumble in the forest turned into a roar. Not only the gravel and stones, but even the trees and rocks also made a low and ancient sound. They resonated thousands of times as if they were responding to this sentence. They were responding to the anger of the king. The canopy of the forest creaked and shook, as if it would be uprooted at any time. The rocks had already broken free from the shackles of the earth and flew into the sky with the soil. A majestic and terrifying aura rose from the forest. The faces of the Knight of Flame changed drastically. They drew their swords and wanted to get close to Brando, but an invisible force swept across the forest and forced everyone to the ground. It made it difficult for them to move. But at this moment, above everyone's head, the dark clouds under the night sky parted. A dazzling golden light, like the rising sun, illuminated the entire sky above the Banker region. Reflected in everyone's eyes was a fiery red light piercing through the vast night sky and falling straight down from the sky. That was the light of the birth of all things. From the flame, wisdom was given to all creatures. At that moment, there was no other color between heaven and earth. The world of law shook. In the entire Rushta region, in the wilderness around Bangkok, in the west of Metz, in Cloak Bay, and even on the front line of the Nazar people, everyone saw this fiery red light falling from the sky. These warriors from another country stopped their war machines, opened the cabin doors and looked up at this marvelous scene. What was reflected in their eyes was the golden sun, the sacred fire from 1,000 years ago that blessed the world forever. Praise the wisdom. The priests of the Nazar people raised their hands and shouted crazily, "Praise the wisdom." The sea of cheers rose and fell one after another. Everything was dim, but at this moment, the constellation of the Flame King shone brightly in the sky above the entire southern part of Wonde. Tens of millions of people witnessed this scene. It was golden red like fire but so pure. Under this dazzling light, a carriage under the protection of a knight passed through the forest near Mulberry Castle and headed in the direction of St. Cantilever Palace. The girl in the carriage, her eyes reflected the flames falling from the sky. In her sparkling eyes, tears involuntarily flowed out. She had been abandoned by everyone in this world. She had never seen her biological parents. In her memory there was only the cold dark forest, the roaring beasts, the dark fear and the pale ghosts in the forest. She had poured all her trust in the hope of having a family, but in return she was coldly abandoned. She was lowly, not worth mentioning, and did not expect anything. However, the only thing she wished for was to have a little tie in this world. Yet even such a wish fell through time and time again. Can I really be important to someone in this world? Of course. That person replied with a smile. Everyone in this world has the right to pursue their own happiness. But this question that she carefully hid in the bottom of her heart finally got an answer today. This answer made her so happy that she almost could not believe it. His Excellency did not lie to her. "Give me back Scar Dash," that voice reverberated above the clouds, reverberating throughout the imperial capital. It was not a vow, but it was more beautiful and firm than any vow in this world. Sitting on the opposite side of the carriage, the mountain maids were already moved to tears. They looked at the crying countess, their hearts full of regret and regret. They had thought that there was nothing wrong with their countess marrying the descendant of a mountain hero. They even found it hard to understand why the countess was so against Her Majesty's decision. Was the countess not a mountain person herself? But now they understood. It turned out that there was someone in this world who dared to go against the entire empire for the countess. If he was not a lunatic, then he must be the most worthy man in this world for the countess to fall in love with. What kind of hero was this? The maids quietly reached out and held their countess' hands. Although Her Majesty the Queen was supreme, they chose to stand on her side at this moment. At this moment, the shining pillar of light outside the carriage was like the fire of dawn, the blaze of dawn. It would definitely light up the darkness and bring light. And at this moment, Bradley's sword finally arrived. What kind of sword was that? It was like a bright and narrow line across the sky, dividing everyone's vision into two, and then there was nothing else between heaven and earth. How could one block such a sword? The knight present had no answer. It seemed that in front of it they could only stretch out their necks and wait to be killed. But Brando gave them an answer. He raised his right hand. There was nothing in his right hand. Clang! A bright line of fire seemed to flash in the darkness. The line that divided the world into two and extended infinitely stopped in front of Brando's outstretched right hand. Then all the illusions were shattered, and the world returned to its original state. The sword in Bradley's hand turned into a silver light in front of everyone's eyes, and heavily chopped at a foot in front of Brando. A long and bright line of sparks was drawn out. Everyone held their breaths at this moment, and some even sucked in a breath of cold air. The Supreme Sword Saint's all-out attack was blocked. It was blocked by such a young man. A few Imperial guards who witnessed this scene couldn't help but pat their faces to prove that they were not dreaming. Then they saw a sword. The sword in Brando's hand gradually revealed its true appearance. It was like a flame burning in the air. Wherever the flame passed, dark red shards with a metallic luster were revealed. These shards were bound together by an invisible force, forming the shape of a sword. A line of small words was engraved on the shards, Mats Visitarsi, that is the appearance of the flaming blade. The Knight of Flame immediately recognized the sword. But in their hearts, there was a voice that roared like a stormy sea. The appearance of the flaming blade was passed down from generation to generation in the holy sanctum through a secret method. But this person didn't have any sword inscriptions on him. How could the appearance of the flaming blade appear in his hand? What did this mean? Wait, look at that girl. At this time, someone finally noticed Andrique next to him. Everyone's gaze turned in that direction. The two swords clashed. Brando looked at Bradley in front of him, and the latter's eyes narrowed slightly. The old man's eyes were burning with golden flames in the young man's eyes. He was shocked. Because this was the inheritance of the flaming blade that had disappeared for thousands of years. The late king appointed him as the successor. How was this possible? But Brendel did not care about his opinion. He only sighed slightly and asked, "What do you think? Is this your answer, your majesty?" The Silver Queen felt her heart skip a beat as if she had missed something, but she quickly calmed down. "You're relying on a mere flaming blade?" She sneered. "But Brando, didn't your grandfather teach you how to be a mature man? I am the emperor of the empire. How can I easily change my words? Then there is only one way left between us." The Silver Queen was so angry that she laughed. Arrogant? Bradley didn't know whether Brando was arrogant or not, but at this moment he wanted to tell the Silver Queen that the young man in front of him didn't just repair the flaming blade. But he couldn't say it because at this time, he saw a golden light in the corner of his eye. Flaming staff. Someone among the Knight of Flame shouted. Andrique finally couldn't hold the flaming staff in her hand. It flew out of her hand and immediately flew towards Brando. Then, under everyone's gaze, it merged into the broken flaming blade in Brando's hand. This scene was something that even Brando didn't expect. Then he felt a powerful force explode in his body. He immediately understood what kind of power it was. It was Odorfai's soul, the power of the flaming orb. In an instant, the gap between the enlightenment of truth and the peak of the law disappeared. Then the seed of law took root and sprouted, and the truth of elements and order left an indelible mark in Brando's heart. At this point, the door of the spiral peak was also crossed by him. It took less than a second. He closed his eyes and felt the shallow sea breeze blowing on his soul. He saw the spirit of all things being born in the water, getting a body in the soil, being protected by the wind, and then being given wisdom by the flame. When he opened his eyes again, the flames in his eyes were already extinguished. Only a hint of golden flame occasionally flashed in the depths of his eyes, in the lower reaches of the law. But his aura was still rising, as if the memories from the ancient times were integrated into the depths of his heart bit by bit. That powerful force grew until it was close to the middle reaches of the law. Then it slowly stopped. Then he heard a system prompt that he hadn't heard for a long time. Obtain the key of fire, obtain the holy sword, broken amber. Brando didn't know what the key of fire was, but the second prompt was like a bolt of lightning that struck directly into the depths of his soul. He couldn't help but stare blankly at the broken pieces of Odorfais in his hands. He looked at the few lines of words written on the open data panel. Amber, damaged. Existence, attack. 214-373 additional fire damage. 110-150 plus 575 strength additional skills. Key of the world, raises the law's attack by 1 realm. Fire of wisdom. Flames of dawn, the wisdom of the wise. The wielder of this sword can display a fire spell from the 1st to 8th circle while attacking. P.S. What Brando wants is to save Scarlet. What do I want? I'm begging for monthly votes. Chapter 1070. Why would it be the sacred sword Amber? Brando certainly remembered that this was the only sacred sword that players had the chance to come into contact with in the game, but how could Odorfais be Amber? His thoughts came to an abrupt end because Bradley's attack had arrived in front of him. Bradley, the sword bearer, was known as the Flame Sword Saint. In the Holy Cathedral, this title was not something that everyone could have. At least it meant that the bearer had mastered an extremely high level of fire element. Bradley was one such bearer. When he was 30 years old, he became famous in a battle. After becoming a knight of the Holy Cathedral, he was directly chosen by the previous Great Holy See to be the backup of the Flame Blessed. However, he did not walk the path of a flame-blessed knight. Instead, he climbed all the way from the priest and bishop to the highest level of power in the Holy Cathedral. Valakin appointed him as the next knight of the Flame Blessed. This position was equivalent to the servant of the Flame Blessed, and had supreme honor. Because he had mastered the fire element, which was the same as Gilt's, the people of the Empire often rumored that Bradley was the successor of the Flame Blessed, and that the Flame Blessed Odorfais would one day appear in the Empire in his hands. However, decades later this prophecy did not come true. Ironically, Bradley actually witnessed the resurrection of Odorfais with his own eyes, but it was not in his hands. If it was 50 years ago, he might have been furious because he was not chosen by the path of the golden flames. However, after half a century of hardships, he had long been accustomed to the changes in power and power. His faith in the path of the golden flames was also firm and would not be easily shaken. What was faith? Faith was persistence. This kind of persistence could even be called stubbornness, but it would never be weakness. Bradley was definitely a stubborn person. Even his sword was called determination. It was said that it was once the sword of a flame-blessed knight of the first generation. The sword was half an arm long, and it could be used with one hand or with two hands. It was firm when attacking, as its name suggested, and it was unstoppable. The long sword swept over with fractal flames. Before it reached Brando felt a scorching aura. This was the power from the fire elemental plane that could burn everything, the power of the ultimate realm. However, the power of the law was immediately weakened to below the peak of the law by the gap of Lonia. The high temperature of the flames seemed to be bearable, not to mention that Brando was holding the sacred sword Odorfice, which was a real fire-blessed sword. He turned around Odorfice's sword. Clang! The two swords collided in the darkness. Sparks flew like a bird of fire in the forest, and immediately ignited the bushes and canopy of the trees. As soon as the two of them exchanged blows, the forest had already fallen into a sea of fire. The Imperial guards who had chased into the forest immediately screamed and ran out. Many of the flame knights in the forest and their colleagues who had rushed over thought that they could stay and help. After all, they were people who were blessed by the fire. How could they be afraid of such an environment like the motley crowd? However, dreams were very plentiful, but reality was often very cruel. As soon as the knights approached the burning flames, their expressions immediately changed. The flames burning in the forest were not ordinary flames, but elemental flames that came from the power of Hell Babatar. This kind of power was one level higher than the flames summoned by the elementalists. Even if it was the magic flame, it was not something that the flame-blessed knight could easily withstand. The flame-blessed allowed them to resist at most ordinary flames. Not only them, but even the Shire, Andrique and Mephistopheles in the forest were forced to stay away. A battle between two supreme realms was not something that they could intervene in. The flame-blessed knight stood far away from the forest, looking at the young man who was fighting with Bradley with a complicated expression. Whether he won or lost, at least at this moment he could be called the youngest Supreme Realm Master in Wond. The Supreme Sword Saint in his early 20s. He was not a descendant of a top noble in a big empire. Although he was a descendant of Sword Saint Darius, everyone knew that this young man did not actually get anything from the Earth Sword Saint. Perhaps at most, he had inherited the excellent bloodline of the Earth Sword Saint. He can't defeat the sword wielder, right? For some reason at this moment, such a ridiculous idea suddenly appeared in everyone's mind. From an outsider's point of view, Brando's current state was indeed not good. Although he managed to block Bradley's sword, only the physical attack was deflected. The weakened power of the flame still penetrated the protection of the collision halo and slashed heavily on his chest. After the Lonia gap weakened the last part of the attack, the remaining flames still burned his coat to nothing. Brando groaned. The Count's coat that had been pierced by the flawless spear finally died, revealing the golden gray armor and tight-fitting combat suit underneath. However, he did not actually suffer much from this attack. At most, there were some burns from the high temperature. This was because the Templar Knight's defense was too ridiculous, and the Lonia Gap, an ancient artifact, was powerful enough. Brando took the time to glance at his status panel. Seeing that he was still in good condition, he immediately took a step forward and changed from one hand to two. The holy sword Odorfice that had been knocked away by determination, spun half a circle in the air and slashed at Bradley. Bradley had only gotten one thing wrong, and that was that Brendel, who was only at the middle level of the Law of Pinnacle, was actually not weaker than him in a head-on battle. Therefore, after his attack, he had misjudged Brando's ability to counterattack. When Brando's sword slashed at him with a bright golden flame line, the Flame Sword Saint suddenly realized his mistake. However, he was an experienced sword saint after all. He immediately took half a step back and raised his sword to block. Opportunity. Brando's thoughts flashed like lightning, and a deep light flashed in his eyes. The Flame Sword Saint, Bradley, who was fully focused, happened to catch that flash of light. He couldn't help but be shocked. As a warrior who had been on the battlefield for a long time, he naturally knew what that gaze meant. That was the decisiveness of an opportunity. In Wond, when a swordsman under the gold rank duel, the difference in personal quality and realm strength would often decide everything. But after the element manifestation, the difference in swordsmanship between the two sides would rise to an extremely high level. The term Sword Saint came from this. But if you were to ask the top Sword Saints or even the ultimate Sword Saints what decided the outcome of a battle, some people would say that it was the psychological quality, the state of the battle, and even the aura, these mysterious things. But as a true veteran swordsman who had experienced hundreds of battles and was also one of the few people in Wond who could see the ultimate realm, Bradley understood that these factors could be summed up in one sentence: experience. In fact, very few people understood that Brando's greatest reliance was not his own extraordinary swordsmanship, nor was it the strength that made people despair at his age. Instead, it was the terrifying combat experience that he had accumulated through the hundreds of years in the game and in this world. Countless battles, countless life and death situations, and countless lessons learned from countless people. Or it could be said that battle instincts. In a battle of life and death, which decision was wrong and which decision was right, it was very likely that would determine whether you would be able to survive the next strike. This was why for many newbies, the experience of walking on the edge of life and death was often the most precious. But how much experience could a person have? It was easier for a person to have such experience to lie on the ground and become a cold corpse. But Brando was different. In this world, his experience was like a monster's existence. Even an old sword saint like Bradley, in fact, unless he had reached the ultimate realm, he didn't care about anything else. Because the scenery I've seen is something you've never even imagined. This was why Bradley was so shocked. Because in such a young swordsman, he actually saw the decisiveness that could only be seen in the most experienced warriors. And the moment he missed, Brando had already struck. The crown of thorns was fully activated, the soul crystal, the berserk talent, and the unimaginable strength of holy sword Odorfice completely erupted at this moment. Brando's long sword moved forward, and the crimson flames that fell from the sky also moved forward. A dazzling light appeared under the clouds, and this sword actually produced an aura that seemed to be able to sweep away 1,000 armies. The opportunity left for Bradley was no opportunity at all because Brando had almost perfectly grasped his mistake. He could only rely on his ultimate realm strength to barely resist this attack. He almost didn't hesitate to open the ultimate planes. But at this moment, what the Flame Sword Saint didn't expect was that determination in his hand actually cracked like a weak wooden sword. It was easily cut into two by Brando's fragmented holy sword Odorfice. Bradley was shocked. Although it wasn't difficult to find praises for the holy sword that the Flame King had once used in the various books of the Holy Cathedral, and even the documents recorded on parchment often used lofty words like radiance, holiness, and supreme. But what made him go crazy was that the previous generation of monks seemed to have unanimously forgotten this matter. They had never described how sharp this sword was. So at this moment he had to use his own experience to prove that the holy sword wasn't just a verbal praise. After all, the sword was a sharp weapon for killing. No matter how glorious the words on it were, it couldn't change its true appearance in battle. At this time Bradley's heart was full of regret. He made up his mind that if he returned to the Holy Cathedral, he would definitely correct this flamboyant and unrealistic style. However, at this moment, he could only watch helplessly as the unstoppable sword slashed at the laws around him. It was no different from slashing at him. He was directly sent flying, drawing a golden red line in the forest, and heavily crashed into the mountain behind him. But before the power on Brando's sword could fully erupt, a dazzling golden line with the tip of his sword as the center extended forward, and the entire mountain slope in front of him was split into two. Above the line, the mountain and the vegetation on it were fragmented and turned into fine powder. Below the line, the incision was as smooth as a mirror. At this moment, almost everyone fell into a state of speechless shock for a long time. Bradley didn't die and he wasn't even seriously injured, but the remaining Supreme Realm powerhouses in the sky couldn't sit still. Richard, Royer, Saipan, and Willock were originally prepared by the Silver Queen to deal with Mephisto and Sydney, who might be hiding in the dark. And according to the news from the battlefield in East Metz, this young man had 3 extremely powerful subordinates who looked like ancient creatures like the Valkyries. But no matter what, for Supreme Realm powerhouses against 2 Supreme Realm powerhouses was a piece of cake. Even if there were a few Valkyries who hadn't reached the Supreme Realm, it would still be more than enough. As for the sword wielder, Bradley, he was specially prepared by the Queen to deal with this young count for insurance. Brando wasn't wrong on this point. But what no one expected was that this plan actually had a problem from the very beginning. Grey Sword Saint Mephistopheles and the Saintess of Leo Palace, Sydney, hadn't appeared yet, but Bradley, who was supposed to be a butcher's paw, had actually lost to this young man. Of course, perhaps it was too early to say who won and who lost, but anyone could see that Brando's current strength was not inferior to Bradley's. Not only did the latter lose his sword in the previous attack, but he was also seriously injured. Under such circumstances, it wouldn't be so easy to defeat this young count. The top existences of the empire couldn't help but look at each other. Now the question for them was who would go up. They had seen the previous battle in the sky with their own eyes. Although the strength Brando displayed couldn't be said to be overwhelming, it should be on par with the strongest of them, Saipan and the Lion Sword Saint, Richard. And there was no doubt that the Ash Sword Saint, who was able to escape from the attacks of two Supreme Realm powerhouses when he was at the peak of the Law Realm, was probably no weaker than them now. Not to mention the Saintess, who was known as the strongest under the Empire of Vala. At this moment, any one of them could easily suppress Brando if they cooperated with Bradley, but the problem was if Mephisto and Sydney joined forces later, would the remaining three still be a match for them? In the end, after hesitating for a moment, Willick drew his sword. The twin paragons of the Empire knew that he was the weakest among the remaining four. Although the young man below could suppress Bradley, he definitely wouldn't be a match for two Supreme Realm powerhouses. Therefore there was no difference whether the weakest or the strongest went down. When Mephisto and Sydney appeared later, the stronger one would have a better chance of winning. However, just as he pulled out his sword, a black sword edge suddenly pierced through the void without any warning. This sword edge seemed to split open space, and what followed was a gray space that unfolded. At that moment, Willick didn't even have time to react as the sword was about to touch his throat. If it weren't for the Lion Sword Saint, Richard, who was at the side, who suddenly attacked and repelled Willick, he would have died prematurely. Willick was stunned for a moment before he reacted. Then he looked in that direction with a gloomy expression. There was no doubt that he knew who had come. But what made everyone's hearts sink was that the other party's strength was higher than they had imagined. This was already the strength of a middle-level Supreme Realm powerhouse. According to the intelligence, this person had just stepped into the extreme planes from the land of trade winds a year ago. What kind of advancement speed was this? Richard immediately withdrew his sword and said coldly, "Long time no see, Mephisto." "That's right." A voice in the void replied, "So, your opponent is me, Richard. You want to save your student?" Richard smiled disdainfully, "You can stop me, but who else can you stop?" But before he could finish his sentence, Willick's expression changed drastically as he yelled, "That's right. Great sage. P.S. This volume's outline has been written, and the name of the second volume has been decided. Actually, I want to sort out the main character's data, but it's a bit troublesome. Who knows which of the main character's attributes was mentioned in the previous chapter? Also, continue to ask for monthly votes." Chapter 1071. Richard turned around and saw a door of light open in midair. An old man with wrinkles all over his face stepped out, wearing a gray linen robe like an ascetic. It was the former Holy Cathedral of Fire, Great Seigneur Vala. Vala glanced in the direction of the forest and narrowed his eyes when his gaze fell on the broken longsword in Brando's hand. He then turned around and looked at the four people in front of him. A sacred and majestic aura instantly filled the air. Richard, Royer, Saipan, and Willick's expressions changed slightly when they came into contact with this aura. They knew in their hearts that this person was already the strongest in the Holy Cathedral 40 years ago, and now it seemed that he had already stepped into the last step of the forbidden zone of men and gods, the peak of the Supreme Realm. And just as Vala stood still, the gray domain in the sky in the other direction retreated like the tide, revealing the hidden figure behind it. It was a middle-aged man with gray hair and carrying a huge sword. His appearance was not conspicuous, as if he had been through a lot. Only the crow's feet at the corner of his eyes could vaguely see that he used to be a distinguished and elegant man. But the aura exuding from his body was extremely shocking, silent and heavy, making people feel as if they were facing a mountain. This person's appearance alone was not special, but the people of the Empire still recognized him at a glance. Grey Sword Saint Mephistopheles. Mephistopheles. Richard said this person's name in a deep voice. His brows were tightly knitted, and his heart sank slightly. His opponent was already in the middle of the Supreme Realm, and was on par with him. The next battle was going to be even more difficult. The forest suddenly quieted down because of the sudden appearance of Great Seigneur Vala and Mephistopheles, leaving only the crackling of the flames. The Knights of the Flame family were a little confused, partly because they did not know what to do. Some of them finally recognized the holy sword Odorpheus, and partly because of Mephistopheles. This demon of the Empire was notorious in the hearts of every Kurlutzian. The path of the golden flames is not blindly converging. The Silver Queen's cold voice sounded again. What are you confused about? Did the Flame King leave you with a yes-man's attitude? You should recognize the choices in your hearts and differentiate between right and wrong. His Majesty is right, Vala unexpectedly agreed. You should have your own justice in your heart and be the master of your own destiny. There is no eternal definition of right and wrong. What is important is the opinion and position in your heart. As Knight of the Flame family, you should understand the true meaning of the Golden Flame Tao. Therefore you should be more resolute than others. Your current confusion will only bring shame to your predecessors. Only then did the knight come to a sudden realization, revealing a look of shame. They drew their swords and bowed to Vara in apology because next, the two sides were probably going to stand on opposite sides and fight. Great sage, thank you for your teachings. We will do our best. Wala only smiled. On the other side of the crystal ball, the Silver Queen looked at this scene with a frosty expression. Vala seemed to be helping her, but in fact, his words did not deviate from the definition of the Golden Flame Tao. He just put aside the question of whether it was right or wrong to discuss this issue, but in fact, he denied the supreme position she stood on. The key was that he planted the seed of resurrection in the hearts of these knights. This was the true meaning of the Golden Flame Tao. It did not bend to the will of any one person, even the Supreme of the Holy Cathedral. Then she, a mere ruler in the secular sense, was even less of a problem. These damned fanatics. She hated them in her heart, and her voice became colder and more threatening. Vala, it seems that you are determined to stand on the opposite side of the Empire. You are even willing to stand with the notorious enemy of the Empire, Mephisto. Are you even going to abandon the dignity of the Holy Cathedral? Vala shook his head. Your Majesty, he said, I am only here today for the Holy Sword. The Silver Queen let out a cold laugh. So what? Do you know why the Holy Sanctum is divided because of you? It's because you old fogies are inflexible and inflexible. You're always pinning your hopes on inanimate objects. Could this be the belief of the descendants of the Flame King, the so-called Golden Flame Path? That is not dead, Your Majesty. That is the will of the sages. Remembering history is not standing still, but because there is something in the past that is worthy of our attention. However, what you do not see is that what my ancestor, the Flame King Gretel, left to this world 1,000 years ago has long been abandoned by the people of the world. What the sages wanted this world to become, but today it has already become another. The Silver Queen's voice was disdainful. Times have long changed, Vala, but you are still stuck in the past. This was not the first time that Vala and the Queen had argued about this issue, but like every argument before, it was destined to be fruitless. Vala was silent and did not refute. The Silver Queen knew that at their position, it was impossible to persuade them with just a few words. She sneered and secretly ordered Richard to take action. Because they were no longer in an advantageous position, the Queen did not intend to give them a chance to stall for time before she called for reinforcements. She knew that Sydney had not appeared yet, and since Mephisto had found Vala, there was no reason for them to let Tessie Castle go. Tessie Castle was guarded by the head of the Night Guards, Tessie Castle, who used to be Sydney's student. Although his loyalty was reliable, he would definitely not be able to stop Mephisto. At this time, Tessie Castle might have already fallen. However, she did not care much about the nobles that Mephisto had rescued. After all, they were just bait. Richard, Royale, and the others received the Queen's signal at the same time and turned to look at each other. Royale and Vala were old acquaintances, so they did not want to face each other. Of the remaining people, only Richard and Saipan had the strength to fight against Mephisto. As for Willick and Bradley, they were a little weaker, and could only be considered second-rate leaders in the Empire. After hesitating for a moment, Richard, the head of the Flame Family Knight Regiment, unsheathed his sword. The blade of the Empire's most famous sword, Steadfast Guard, flowed out like a pool of silver light, blocking the other three. He then said to Royale and the others, I'll stop Vala. You guys split up and stop Mephisto. Now that the situation had developed to this point, everyone understood that it was impossible to stop the other party at this time. The best choice was to find a way to change the balance of power on the battlefield before Sydney arrived. Out of the three leaders, Brendel was the weakest, so the moment Richard opened his mouth, the others understood what he meant. Among the three, Grand Wizard Royale did not want to bully the weak. He smiled bitterly and went straight for Mephisto, who was not far away. With a sweep of his 5 fingers, a lightning bolt that was almost 100 meters long struck towards Mephisto. This was the 6th circle air spell, Chain Lightning. Although Royale was a wizard of the law, this kind of low-level, elemental spell was a piece of cake for him. He was also known for his supreme magic skills, and could cast spells below the 7th circle in an instant. His reputation as a sky wizard was not undeserved. However, Royale's strongest point was actually counterspell. His elemental mirror realm could reflect all mana, and that was how he got his title of Lightless Reversion. Therefore he chose Mephisto as his opponent because he was at a disadvantage. It was like a lightning dragon that crossed the night sky, and the forest near the Cold Dew Manor was reflected in a snow-white light. However, in the face of this attack, Mephisto did not even use his sword. He just reached out and tore the lightning dragon into pieces. Sparks flew all over the sky. However, Royale's attack was only to buy time. As soon as Mephisto blocked the lightning, he felt the space around him folding layer by layer. He looked up and found that the space had been sealed into a spherical space from the bottom up. Although the sky and earth were still outside the sphere, there was a vague feeling of being separated by a crystal. He knew that this was a magic boundary set up by Royale, but it was not the kind of boundary that was made of paper. The boundaries set up by Supreme Realm wizards usually contain the power of their ultimate realm, so it was not wrong to say that it was a more changeable version of the ultimate realm. Mephisto instantly understood his opponent's intention. He pulled out his sword, and at this time Royale had already hidden his figure. It was not a useless spell like invisibility, but a real leaving from the material world and hiding in a parallel dimension. At the same time, two roaring flames instantly formed in the spherical space. If Brando was here, he would definitely recognize that this thing looked almost the same as his fire giant, but its size was several times larger, and its strength had increased exponentially. This was the Fire Deity Elder. As soon as the Fire Deity Elder was summoned by Royale, it immediately roared and rushed toward Mephisto. The Ash Sword Saint was not a novice who had never fought with wizards before. He knew that this thing was just a means to buy time for his opponent to cast a more powerful spell. He did not think and directly opened the ultimate domain. A gray world appeared behind Mephisto. It was like a boundless, lifeless wilderness. Other than the endless gray, the horizon and the sky seemed to have merged into one. However, the Ash Sword Saint waved his hand, and suddenly figures appeared on the gray ground. They seemed to have grown out of the gray world. They did not have faces and their bodies were only gray. They held longbows and swords in their hands, and tens of millions of them stood in rows like an army. Without needing anyone to give orders, the gray figures raised their longbows and shot forward. Tens of thousands of gray arrows that blotted out the sky and covered the earth were like a storm passing through. The two Fire Jinn elders were directly shot into hedgehogs and exploded into countless flames on the spot. Mephisto held the giant sword in his hand and did not move. The gray army rushed forward and spread in all directions along with his gray domain. Royale, who was hiding in the parallel dimension, immediately could not stand still. Although he was not in the material world, Mephisto's gray world was the same. Although the space in the spherical enchantment was almost infinite, there was a limited place for him to hide. He had just fought with Mephisto, so he could not be thousands of miles away. Therefore, when Mephisto's army moved, he immediately knew that Mephisto had caught his weakness. This enemy of the Empire, who had experienced life and death several times, really lived up to his reputation. No wonder he could escape from the Empire's encirclement time and time again and continue to cause trouble for the Empire. Royale put away the general contempt and arrogance of wizards toward other professions and had to go all out. He quietly chanted a spell, and the sky in the spherical space was immediately covered with dark clouds. Endless lightning storms fell from the sky and instantly struck Mephisto's gray army into ashes. The gray army that Mephistopheles had summoned was, in fact, the manifestation of his law. Once the gray army was destroyed, a hole was naturally torn in his domain. At the same time he was injured and let out a muffled groan. But it was also at this time that he found the location of Royale through the power ripples caused by his incantation. The gray sword in his hand swept towards that direction like a stormy sea. The surging laws immediately caused the entire space to tremble. Royer could no longer hide in the parallel dimension and had to reveal himself in the material world. The next moment, a sword light that was several hundred meters long immediately swept across his waist. Royale's body shook slightly as if it was cut in two, but there was no sudden scene of blood. His body that was cut in two disappeared into the air like broken water ripples. Illusion. Royale appeared on the other side of the sword light. His face was pale and the ring on his right index finger had shattered. If it weren't for the life protection ring, he would have been cut in half by his opponent. That gray sword could actually ignore his magic defense, which made him horrified. After the previous round of battle, although Mephisto had suffered heavy injuries, he also lost an elemental ring and a life ring. The most important thing was that he was forced to reveal himself by Mephisto. The biggest advantage of a wizard in a battle against a warrior was the unpredictable spells that allowed them to always be in an active position. Once they were passive, it was the warrior's home field. Just as Royale opened a magic boundary and moved the space above the Cold Dew Manor out of the material world, Richard and the others also faced their opponents. Richard himself blocked in front of Vala, while Willick flew down into the forest below. But what the great commander of the Flame Family Knight Regiment did not expect was that the tower-defying Saipan stayed behind to block in front of Vala. His opponent's approach was beyond his expectations. Although his own strength was slightly inferior to Vala's, it was not difficult for him to delay Vala for a while. Richard's original intention was to let the other two take the opportunity to subdue Brando first. With the two of them working together with Bradley and the other three Supreme Class, the young man named Erwin had no chance at all. But he was a soldier and his duty was to obey orders, but he forgot that his partners were not the same. Royale was a court mage and only obeyed the orders of the royal family, and Willick's situation was similar. However, apart from these two people, the man who was known as the Tower-Defying or the Near-Divine Wizard was a complete outsider. Richard could not help but look back at him, only to see that he was expressionless and did not intend to communicate with him. In fact, this person was not a person who was good at talking. His reputation was spread far and wide because of his terrifying strength and legendary experience. Saipan was once a real civilian. He followed an old wizard and was lucky enough to manifest his element. He once served in the Imperial Knight Regiment, but because his element, world reflection, was not valued, he left in disappointment. So far, his experience was not much different from most of the wizards in the Empire who pursued power and status. But just a few years later, when he reappeared in people's sight again, he had already activated his element. His elemental element, world reflection, could reflect everything in the material world. It seemed like a useless illusion elemental element, but after elemental activation, this law showed a terrifying power. This was because in Saipan's hands, he was actually able to make the reflection of the world of laws appear in the real world. This wasn't a domain created by an insignificant individual's comprehension of laws, but a true reflection of the world of laws. The power of this reflected world was almost 1,000 times greater than that of the extreme planes, so its might could be imagined. Therefore, the people called him the wizard closest to God, and it was not a rumor. However, this kind of reflection was not without a price. Even he himself had only completely reflected the White Tower in the material world once. In that battle, he almost razed a legion of the Zell to the ground with his own strength. That was how the title of the Tower-Defying came about. But after that, Saipan never showed such powerful strength again. Because of his early experience, Saipan had always maintained a distant relationship with the Empire. He appeared here at this moment because he was now employed by the Imperial family. But this kind of employment was not a relationship of loyalty, but nothing more than a relationship of power or money. In the face of such a person, even if Richard was dissatisfied, he did not dare to speak casually. Besides, he also understood that the other party was not his subordinate. Well, Willick and Bradley should be enough to deal with that young man. If this guy stays, at least it will be easier for me. In the heart of this great leader, he could only helplessly comfort himself. Author's note: I spent some time yesterday to look up some details and information. At the same time, I took a lazy break. After all, I'm going to write a battle, so I need to understand the main character's attributes and details. That way I'll be prepared. Also, I expect that after this volume is finished, I will update the main character's attributes. At that time, everyone can help to find if there are any bugs. Finally, I want to thank student Yu Chinzi for helping me organize the information. Chapter 1072. In the sky, the Supreme Realm's attack immediately caused the night sky of Rushta to become unstable. The lines of law shattered and trembled, causing the magic particles floating in the air to boil. The leaves of the trees danced as if they were possessed. The flickering lines of law flashed in the air, and the mountains were immediately torn apart. However, the battle in the forest did not end there. After Brendel sent Bradley flying with his sword, he did not even have the time to look at his teacher Mephistopheles' battle. Instead, he flashed to the top of the collapsed mountain. In the meantime, several Flame Family Knights tried to cross the lines of flame to stop him, but Brando, who had activated the Crown of Thorns and the Berserk talent, was already at his peak. As soon as he passed by, 7 or 8 shadows appeared in the sky with the 9 luminary sword art. Before the Flame Family Knights could react, the flaming blade had already swept through with the violent power of space. The swords in their hands were forcibly removed in an instant. The suppressive power made it impossible for them to resist, and they could only watch as the shattered holy swords penetrated their bodies. Brando withdrew the shadows he created, and countless dismembered bodies fell from the sky like raindrops, filling the sky with a rain of blood. These people could not even stop him for half a second. Brando was very clear about his own situation. He was now at full strength and could even be said to be in peak condition. He could even fight against an intermediate limiter. However, this state could not last for long. He only glanced at the collapsed mountain, then took a step back, raised his sword with both hands, moved his right hand back and slashed down. Under the flaming blade, the layers of soil immediately collapsed, forming a bowl-shaped depression with a diameter of more than 100 meters. However, the moment the power of law hit the center, a black crack that was more than 1,000 meters long silently appeared in the ground. Brando knew that Bradley had been swept into the mountain by his sword, but he was not seriously injured. His opponent was a limiter, so how could he be injured so easily? Brando's plan was very simple. It could even be said that it was the same as Richard's. It was to cut off one of Bradley's fingers before he could react and change the balance of power on the battlefield. Thus, his first goal was to beat Bradley while he was down and kill him in one fell swoop while he was at a disadvantage. Although killing a limiter might sound a little inconceivable, this world was filled with all sorts of chances and coincidences. No one could guarantee that they would succeed. What Brando wanted was this what if. If he succeeded, then the situation would be very different. Of course, even if he failed, he wouldn't lose anything. That was why he was so determined. Brando could not guarantee that his attack would have much effect. It was not as if he had never experienced a Supreme Realm battle, whether it was in this life or the last, but no one could say for sure how much of an impact a Supreme Realm attack could have on the extreme planes. However, after recalling his past experience of fighting against a world boss, Brando still cautiously estimated that this attack would at most injure the other party, but it was still a distance away from killing him. However, he was not in a hurry. Instead, he calmly retreated, because he knew that the initiative was still in his hands. It was at this moment that a golden red flame burst out from the cracks of the stacked rocks. Brando raised his hand and with a soft hum, the sword wind had already missed him and flew into the air. The flame that scattered in the air brushed past his hair, burning off a few strands. Brando could not help but break out in a cold sweat. He immediately knew that he had made the right choice. If he had not retreated, then this sword would have beheaded him. He looked up and saw that the flame that burst out from the ground was rapidly retreating to both sides, revealing a sharp sword that looked like a whirlwind behind it, and the flame sword master, Bradley, who was holding it. The latter's condition was obviously not ideal. There was a bloody wound from his left shoulder to his right abdomen. Although it was not a penetrating wound, it did not look too easy. Bradley's injuries were rather serious, which was within his expectations. The attack just now was obviously a sword that Bradley hoped to turn the tables on, but he never dreamed that this young man would be so cautious. Brando looked at the sword in Bradley's hand, and his eyes narrowed slightly. He was no stranger to the sword formed by the wind. It was an elemental sword. Almost all elemental swords were imaginary swords. Apart from adding a certain amount of elemental damage, they were not sharp, but they had a special characteristic. That was, they could not be broken. As an extreme sword master, Brando was not surprised that Bradley had a backup top-notch weapon. In fact, experts of his level, including himself, would usually prepare several swords. For example, he had Frost Chance Cinna, Francis Grip, and the newly acquired Duel as backup weapons. However, Bradley actually chose to use an elemental sword. It could only be said that he was frightened by the sharpness of Odorfice. But this was not wise. Brando rejoiced in his heart. When Bradley met him with his sword again, he simply chose to meet it head-on, as if he was trading his life for Bradley's. Bradley was shocked. His first thought was that there was a trick. Some swordsmen had an extremely valiant fighting style. They often chose to trade injury for injury to force their opponents to be restrained. But this tactic was almost useless against someone above the Supreme Realm. How could an old sword saint with nearly half a century of combat experience be affected by such a small trick? But when his sword continued to move forward, he found that what happened next was somewhat beyond his imagination. Before the sword in his hand touched Brando's body, it seemed to have hit an invisible barrier. This barrier did not have any resistance, and it was not like any kind of defensive spell he knew. But what he saw was that the wind sword in his hand actually dissipated when it passed through this barrier. After being stunned for nearly half a second, Bradley finally understood what he had encountered. Willpower barrier. At that moment he almost wanted to curse because the main damage of the elemental sword was magic damage. But magic damage was almost useless against Brando's monster-like willpower. But how could Bradley think that a human would have such an amazing willpower barrier? For a moment he almost thought that the Brando in front of him was not a descendant of Darius, or that the Earth Sword Saint himself was a dragon or something else. But in short, it was impossible for him to be an iron person. But no matter what he thought, he could only watch helplessly as his opponent's sword pierced his chest. It was supposed to be the left side of his chest where his heart was, but at the last moment he managed to avoid hitting his vitals. Bradley immediately let out a blood-curdling scream. He stretched out his hand and pushed the sword away with all his might. The shattered sword was pulled out of his chest, bringing with it a large amount of dazzling blood and rising steam. He pressed on the wound with one hand and desperately retreated. Because the sword almost tore a third of his lung, he almost immediately coughed, and the fragments of his organs spewed out along with the blood foam. But Brando did not seize this opportunity to pursue. This was because he had also suffered heavy injuries. After all, Bradley's sword still caused him damage. He glanced at the data panel and he had lost more than a quarter of his life. This was the result after more than 90% of the damage was offset. The gap between the supreme realm and the peak of the law was indeed like a chasm. He coughed softly, looked up, and saw that one of the Empire's twin paragons, Willick, had finally rushed over. There was no chance. Brando felt that it was a pity. The opportunity to kill an Empire's supreme realm was right in front of him, and he was almost successful. But as he understood, this world was always full of opportunities and coincidences. There was nothing to regret. Willick happened to witness the scene of Brando seriously injuring Bradley in midair, and he could not help but feel a sense of disbelief. Although Bradley was only considered a second-rate supreme realm in the Empire, he was still a supreme realm. And yet, the number 3 figure of the Holy Cathedral of Fire had been defeated by a young man in his early 20s. He was well aware that his own level was probably lower than Bradley's, so for a moment his heart was filled with a strong sense of vigilance, afraid that he would accidentally lose his reputation in a fight with a junior. In fact, he might even end up dead. Therefore, he originally had the opportunity to kill Brando at the first moment, but he still cautiously attacked from afar, intending to test the waters first. The sword flashed and a flash of light arrived first. At this moment, Brando was rather helpless, and he could only give up on pursuing and block with his sword. The sword collided with the holy sword Odorfice in his hand and was immediately deflected to one side, sweeping towards the forest on the side. It was as if an invisible razor had sliced through a patch of ancient trees, causing the forest near the Cold-Dew Manor to immediately become bare. Brando, who had noticed this scene, could not help but secretly curse in his heart. He was afraid that after this battle, this famous place of the Empire would really become a worthless wilderness. He heard that the owner of this place seemed to be the royal family. He did not know if Her Majesty the Queen would be heartbroken after losing so many people. After blocking the sword, he actually felt a faint numbness in his arm. He could not help but immediately become vigilant, knowing that this was a sign that his crown of thorns was about to lose its effectiveness. I can't drag this on any longer, Brando thought to himself. His gaze swept across the sky, taking in the battle in the air. At this moment, Mephisto and Royer were long gone, and the battle between Richard, Saipan and Vala could be said to be earth-shattering. Saipan had already reflected the land of floating stones in mid-air, which was a scene in the elemental plane of Earth. In this domain, most of his defensive spells were greatly strengthened, but even so he could only barely block Vala's attack. Before Vala became a holy sepulchre, he majored in the Nord Holy Words, which was an extremely ancient holy spell. It was said that it was related to an ancient clan called Reiser. This clan did not have a fixed residence on the continent, and traveled as their religion. Their power also came from the myths and legends of many worlds. And to make the legends manifest in the material world. This was the ultimate meaning of this holy spell. Vala raised his hand and summoned 2 trumpeter angels. These were the envoys of the gods in the myths of the heavens, possessing strength close to the lower level of the elemental truth. Vala, with the strength of the peak of the elemental truth, summoned creatures of the lower level of the elemental truth, and it seemed to be effortless. The Nord holy words were so unreasonable. He also held a golden sword in his hand. How terrifying this sword was. Vala held the sword in his hand, and every time he stabbed, there would be a ray of light. As long as these rays of light shone on Saipan's defensive spells, no matter whether the spells were of the 7th circle, 8th circle, or 9th circle, they would immediately vanish. Brando even saw Saipan's absolute barrier spell, which was actually pierced through by the other party's sword. And it should be known that this was the top spell of the 11th circle of law magic, which could be said to be the highest level of magic that mortals could master in the mortal world. Therefore he immediately understood the identity of the sword. It was also one of the most legendary holy swords, Light of Contempt, the top artifact forged by the Light of the Golden People, Martha. It was said that it once killed the Butcher of Truth, Kujur, and was later lost in the Battle of Ebabel. Some people said that it broke in that battle, then turned into starlight and disappeared from the world. This sword had a characteristic, and that was to break all spells. In other words, it was said that there was a line of description in the attributes of this sword. It was only 4 words, but it was enough to explain everything. But because it had existed in legends, Vala could use the Nord holy words of vision and faith to manifest it from the long river of fate. Although the power was not as good as the original, it was enough to defeat Saipan. Even Saipan the Tower Rebel had no way to break through Vala's defense circle, let alone Richard the Imperial Gate. Although the Flame Family Knight Regiment commander was known as the strongest defense of the Empire, it was only defense. In fact, he had been roaring in midair for a long time, but he couldn't do anything to Vala. Vala was fighting against 2 enemies, but he still had the upper hand in the battle. If he didn't know that the Nord holy words had a weakness of consuming too much energy, Brando would almost think that this great sage was invincible. But in any case, Vala was an existence that had 1 foot in the sage realm. Legend had it that after the War of the Holy Saints, because the Sea of Magic was isolated from the world by the Dark Dragon, there had been no one who surpassed the supreme realm among the mortals for more than 1,000 years. In other words, Vala represented the peak of the mortal world at this moment. As long as the silver person and the gold person didn't show their strength, then there was probably no one in this world who could beat him. Of course, after the arrival of the demonic wave, this situation might be broken in a very short time. But Vala could only be said to have a slight advantage. It was basically wishful thinking to talk about winning. After all, his opponents were the 2 poles of the Empire. It was impossible for Saipan and Richard not to know the weakness of the Nord holy words. So the current situation was no longer suitable for a protracted battle. Brando immediately made a decision in his heart, and it was at this time that Willick's sword was already in front of him. He raised his sword and blocked the long sword that was slashing at him. The broken holy sword Oderfice in his hand shook slightly, and at the same time, his HP dropped by a line. This phenomenon immediately rang the alarm bell for him. It meant that the crown of thorns had disappeared, and his defense was close to 0. He had to break through. The Shire. While blocking Willick's attack, he contacted the others through telepathy. At this time, the Shire, Mephistopheles and Andrique were not idle. In fact, they had been surrounded by the Flame Family Knight for a long time. While receiving Brando's order, the Shire forced several Flame Family Knights to retreat with a force field wave, and used the Law of Stop to freeze the 2 weakest among them. Because of the heavy losses before, the Flame Family Knight was a little too cautious at the moment. When the Shire suddenly attacked, their first choice was not to attack, but to retreat to protect their companions who were frozen by the spell. This gave the Shire a chance to breathe. "What is it, Sir Lord?" he asked while panting. "Don't continue to fight, come closer to me." "Are we going to execute the next part of the plan, Sir Lord?" "Almost." At this moment, Brando once again forced Willick's sword back. The swords in Oderfice's and Willick's hands clashed in midair, and dazzling sparks splashed out. The sword in Willick's hand was not ordinary. It was the prisoner's song. Brando knew that it was a famous ancient weapon. The characteristics of this weapon were its sharpness and indestructibility, so it just happened to restrain Oderfice's incomparably high attack. With this exchange of swords, Brando felt a burst of weakness, and Willick obviously noticed it, but he could not confirm whether it was a trick or not. However, this probing attack was only temporary. After forcing Willick to retreat, Brando immediately took the opportunity to put on the double-ringed snake's pupil. These 2 fantasy rings were his spoils of war in the deadly frost forest. Because it required magic power to be at the pinnacle of the law to wear it, he had been keeping them dusty until today. And this set of rings had a very special set attribute, which was to increase the bloodline and perception attributes by 100 points. Bloodline was still okay, but perception was extremely difficult to increase in the game. When this attribute was increased to more than 100 points, the perception would become extraordinary, and they would obtain magic vision and other characteristics. As soon as he put on the rings, he immediately felt the whole world change. Willick's body emitted circles of translucent ripples, and in midair, where Saipan and Vala were fighting, ripples that were hundreds of meters long swept across the sky. He knew that these were actually magic ripples. He raised his head and saw the space enchantment that Royer had set up before floating in the sky. Clang! The flaming blade and the prisoner's song collided once again. This time, Brando took 7 steps back, and the crown of thorns finally lost its effect. It was as if he was in a weak state after going berserk, and he began to fall into a difficult situation. At this moment, Willick finally discovered the abnormality in Brando's body. It's the crown of thorns. At this time Bradley suddenly shouted. As a high-ranking member of the Holy Cathedral of Fire, he certainly knew these inherited skills of the Templar Knight. What's more, he had seen the scene of Brando and the Flame Knight fight before, so he already knew that Brando was a Templar Knight. I see, Willick's eyes flashed with a deep light. He knew that his opportunity had come. And Brando also seized his own opportunity when Willick was distracted. The Shire, dispel the spell in that direction in the sky. He immediately yelled at his mage servant. Chapter 1073. Medisha was like a silver cheetah running through the forest. Her calm expression did not reflect the anxiety in her heart. Why isn't my lord summoning Hipamera and me? What is he waiting for? At this moment, a figure flashed through the forest. She suddenly braked, her boots plowing 2 ditches in the soil that was covered with pine needles. After Medisa stopped, she saw a person standing in the middle of the forest. To be exact, it was a woman. If the lower half of her body was still considered as a person, then she would be considered a person. Hipamera also stopped. Who is she? She looked at Medisha and asked. Andesha? Medisha looked at the woman in front of her in disbelief. The woman slowly turned her head. It was the Lord of Decay, Andesha, who was imprisoned in the Empire after being defeated by Brando and Veronica in the Loop of Trade Winds. The woman's condition was very different from what Medisha remembered. Her smooth face was covered with blood vessels that extended from her neck upwards like blood-red roots. Her eyes were pitch black, with a pupil that looked like a blood jade marrow embedded in the middle. It looked extremely demonic. Medisha was shocked. This was the mutated state of the blood of God. Most of the tree herders' patriarchs had been baptized by the blood of God once, which was why they looked like neither humans nor ghosts. However, she had never heard of anyone being baptized by the blood of God a second time. Could it be that the tree herders' research on the blood of God had progressed further? But what puzzled her the most was that Andesha should have been imprisoned in the deepest part of the Empire's prison, and not here. Why are you here, Andesha? Andesha saw that it was Medisha and smiled strangely. She did not answer and walked into the depths of the forest. Stop right there. Medisha frowned and scolded. Andesha stopped and turned back with a smile. Little princess, this time we are friends, not enemies. No one is your friend, not your enemy. Medisha knitted her brows and replied in an unfriendly tone, You better explain why you're here. Little princess, if you have the time to care about me, why don't you care about your lord? Andesha raised her head and looked in the direction of the mountain. At this time, a silver ray of light rose from the mountain where the Frostdew Manor was located. It was like a resplendent silver line that cut across the night sky, splitting the stars in the sky into 2. Medisha's face was illuminated by the radiance in the air. She could tell that it was the direction of the Frostdew Manor. Her expression changed slightly, and she turned around to look at Andesha coldly. She no longer cared about the other party's intentions, and directly rushed in that direction. But just as she was about to leave, she suddenly remembered something. Andesha had called her Little Princess, so how did she know about her identity? This thought flashed through her mind, but soon, her concern for the Count overcame her. She forced herself to become focused again. She's Andesha? Hipamera glanced behind her. She did not experience the battle in the Loop of Trade Winds, and only knew bits and pieces about it from the people around Brando. She was not as fearful of Andesha as Medisha, and was even a little curious. After all, Andesha was once the Count's enemy. You have to be careful of her. Medisha looked at Andesha and reminded her, none of the 12 tree herders are kind people. Their inheritance existed long before the War of the Holy Saints. It seems like she used the same method to identify me. This means that their inheritance is still intact. Hipamera nodded slightly, then sighed, but it's a pity that the tree herders were once believers of the goddess. In the dark forest behind them, Andesha looked at their backs thoughtfully, and the corners of her mouth curled up strangely. Their strength is rising so quickly, she sighed softly. This is a good era, but it's a pity that some people don't know how to appreciate it. Andesha raised her right hand, and the blood jade bracelet on her wrist shone brightly under the moonlight. She stroked the bracelet and said, The flaming blade has already rushed over. That little fellow has turned the Cold-Dew Manor upside down. That woman has underestimated him. Right, I met his subordinate just now, it's that princess. She suddenly fell silent for a moment, then nodded. Yes, I understand, my lady. Royale was known as the strongest magus in the empire, and ordinary magi could only dream of dispelling his magic. However, the Shire pointed his finger forward, and countless silver threads of law extended from his hand, converging into a beam that struck the magic barrier in the air. The magic barrier trembled for a moment before disintegrating, and Mephisto and Royale's figures appeared behind it. In the eyes of others, a beam of silver light rose from the top of the mountain where the Cold Dew Manor was located, like a bright silver line across the night sky, splitting the stars in the sky into two. Saipan was fighting with Vala, and he almost lost his mind when he saw this scene. As an old rival of Royale, he knew the former's strength best. However, his old rival was already one of the top existences in the Empire 20 or 30 years ago. Although he had never fought with the Empire's #1 person Vala, the difference between them was only about the same. In other words, although he had not yet reached the peak of the Supreme Realm, he was only a hair's breadth away. Furthermore, Vala was known as the Lord of Mirrors, and was quite skilled in dispelling spells and reflecting spells. He had considerable attainments in the field of spells, and even Saipan was ashamed of his inferiority. Someone who could easily dispel Vala's spells, wasn't that the legendary sage? However, Saipan knew that no mortal had set foot on the Forbidden Realm for thousands of years. He could not help but be shocked. Could it be that the Bugis finally could not help but intervene personally? At this moment he was not the only one who had such a thought. Everyone stopped in an instant and looked in the direction of the forest. After all, if the Bugis were to intervene in this battle, then the nature of the battle would be completely different. "Bugis, how dare you break the contract?" The Silver Queen's angry scream echoed in the sky. The Shire was slightly stunned, and immediately understood that there was a misunderstanding. He immediately straightened out his thoughts, so he raised his head and stepped forward and smiled slightly to the air. "Your Majesty, the Silver Folk have no intention of intervening in the affairs of the earth, but the Sacred Covenant is concluded on the cornerstone of the War of the Holy Saints, and maintaining the order of this world is also the duty of the Silver Folk." "It's you," the Silver Queen's voice turned cold, "the Shire." Brando was a little surprised by what was happening. He never dreamed that the people of the Empire would have such a misunderstanding. He could not help but look at his wizard attendant, knowing that the latter did not have much memory of what happened decades ago, but the Shire was smiling as if everything was under control. "It's been a long time," the Shire said with a smile, "Your Highness." Brando could not help but grit his teeth, thinking that this guy was indeed better at showing off. "I haven't seen you for decades and you haven't changed at all from that time," the Silver Queen said coldly. "You really are a Silver Folk. Although I've suspected this for a long time, I didn't expect the Bugis to have started planning decades ago. William and Solomon keep saying that they have no interest in the struggle for power in the mortal world, but in fact, the Bugis still have everything under their control." In the face of everything shown in the crystal ball, Constance, who looked like a 15-year-old girl, narrowed her eyes slightly and spat out a word contemptuously, "Hypocrite." At this moment, William, who was far away in the Great Glacier, could not help but sneeze a few times. The leader of the Wizards of the Silver Alliance could not help but look back in confusion in the biting cold wind. The Silver Folk were not born with diseases. Could it be that someone was secretly cursing him behind his back? The Shire, who quietly let the Bugis take the blame, smiled but did not refute the Silver Queen's words. Instead, he replied confidently, "Your Majesty, no one can do whatever they want, whether it's you or the Silver Folk. It's the same." The Silver Queen was silent. The situation was a little beyond her expectations. The Bugis had not been involved in the affairs of the earth for thousands of years, not to mention that they had such an agreement on the battlefield of the final battle decades ago. These damn Silver Folk dared to go back on their words. She was furious, but for a moment she found that she could not come up with any way to deal with the other party's shamelessness. Although she had many cards in her hands, that was only relatively speaking. No one dared to act rashly in front of the Silver Folk. The Shire was the only one in front of her, but who knew what else was hidden behind him? But the Silver Queen was cautious, and Brando and the Shire were also very nervous. The others thought that they had backup, and even the Grey Sword Saint Mephistopheles looked over thoughtfully. Only Vara, the great seigneur, looked around a little doubtfully, and finally his eyes fell on the Shire. He narrowed his eyes, apparently seeing something, but did not speak. The Shire racked his brains to think of a way not to be exposed, and Brando was also thinking of a way to escape. He was a little surprised that Sydney and Veronica had not yet arrived. It was not that there was no way to escape at the moment, but it was a little troublesome. It was the misunderstanding of the Empire people and the improvisation of the Shire that surprised him a little. At the moment it was best to scare off the Silver Queen, but the possibility was very small. He could only see how much time he could delay. But he also knew in his heart that it was also not good for him to drag this out. If Sydney did not arrive, then Her Majesty's backup should be arriving soon. Just a moment ago, he had received news from the witches that the flame blades stationed in Mulberry Castle were on their way here. The good news was that the possibility of rescuing Scarlet was a little greater, but the bad news was that if Sydney did not arrive, he would be in trouble. But sometimes what you feared most would come true. Brando had hoped that he could delay for a while, but suddenly his face changed and he looked up. Suddenly the air was filled with an unreal aura. The surrounding scenery seemed real and illusory, just like a dream. He had experienced such a scene once when he was in Fulton Harbor. It was a high-ranking witch who had arrived at the battlefield. But obviously it was not his subordinate. In just a moment, everyone looked up in the air and saw that a new supreme expert had arrived. At this time, 3 light doors suddenly opened in the sky, and 3 witches stepped out calmly, exuding an amazing aura that made the whole battlefield quiet. They were indeed supreme existences. Brando narrowed his eyes and recognized Atatrice and the Witch King. As for the last little girl, he had never seen her before and had no impression of her. But he was secretly complaining in his heart. The flaming blade was troublesome enough, and he did not expect the Silver Queen to send her personal forces over. We can't wait any longer, we have to retreat. He forced himself to calm down and then glanced at the Shire, but he did not pin his hopes on an illusory opportunity. Although the Bugas were famous, if a name alone could scare the Silver Queen away, then the other party's previous actions were too ridiculous. No one here would be naive enough to really believe in the Covenant, and as the Supreme of the Empire, the Silver Queen was even more so. If the Bugas had placed their strongest fleet here, or if William or Solomon had come personally, she might have hesitated for a moment. But right now, the Shire's words obviously could not change the other party's determination. The Silver Queen had not spoken yet, but Brando knew that she was just making a choice, or secretly mobilizing her secret trump card, and these witches were probably one of her countermeasures. The Shire could not delay for too long, Brando realized at this moment. The Shire also did not take the initiative to speak. As a former genius of the younger generation of the Highland mages, he also had extraordinary talent. Everything that Brando could figure out, he naturally already knew. At this moment he was coping with the changes by remaining unchanged, trying to buy time for Brando as much as possible. After a moment of silence, the Silver Queen suddenly said, "Wait dash." She frowned on the back of the crystal ball, and her voice became suspicious. The Bugas have never broken their promises, this is not their style of doing things. Brando's heart sank. He did not expect the Silver Queen to find the problem so quickly. If the other party was just making a choice, then she might have some scruples when she attacked, but if she saw that the Shire was just a fox pretending to be a tiger, then she would definitely go all out. He quickly took a step back secretly and quietly gestured to Mephisto in midair. The latter had returned to the battlefield at this moment after Royal's spell was lifted. Although he had some doubts about the relationship between Brando and the Bugas, when he saw Brando's gesture, he immediately understood. There's a misunderstanding, don't worry, I'll explain later, let's carry out the plan first. The plan was to retreat, and Mephisto immediately put away his sword without hesitation. Chapter 1074. Mephisto and Royal had yet to decide a victor between them. When Mephisto sheathed his sword, Royal couldn't help but be stunned for a moment. He then saw Mephisto take a step back, and his figure faded into the gray domain. Royal raised his gray and white eyebrows slightly and put down his right hand. The spell in his hand suddenly disappeared. There were all kinds of rumors about Mephisto in the Empire. Some were absurd, but none of them mentioned that he was a coward. Although Royal was not familiar with Mephisto, he could see that Mephisto was not afraid of him. He thought of something and subconsciously glanced at the forest. In the forest, Brando and the Shire looked at each other. The Silver Queen was already suspicious. It was only a matter of time before she saw through their lies. The two made the same choice at the same time and fled in different directions. The two turned around and fled. Mephistopheles quickly followed Brando. Endrique was a little slower. She hesitated for a moment before choosing another direction. The Silver Queen was stunned for a moment before she reacted. "Catch them?" she screamed angrily. A terrifying force swept across the sky. It was the Witch Queen. She stretched out a finger, and a silver ring of light shot out from her fingertip. The ring of light expanded in an instant, extending to a radius of several miles, like a visible wave of water. In the blink of an eye, it engulfed the entire forest and caught up to Brendel. Brando only felt the temperature suddenly drop. The biting cold wind blew and the sound of ice wolves chasing behind him could be heard. He subconsciously reached out to touch his face. His palm was wet with snow and broken ice. A thick layer of frost appeared on the forest floor from far to near, covering the piles of dead leaves, moss and rocks. Thousands of trees withered and leaves fell one after another. However, before the leaves fell to the ground, they were already frozen. The branches were covered with icicles. When the north wind blew, it made a rustling sound. Brando landed on a piece of rock and felt something heavy under his feet. He cursed inwardly as he was unable to raise his foot. The white frost on the ground seemed to come alive as it spread up his riding boots. In the blink of an eye, a thick layer of ice had formed. This was the power of the north wind, the element of the Witch Queen. This element was one of the most important inheritances of the witches. It came from the Witch Queen, and the maids of the Witch Queen also had the same inheritance. Although it was inferior, it didn't affect the power it displayed in front of Brando. In just a breath's time he could no longer feel his frozen foot. He could not help but be shocked. The Witch Queen's strength was already at the peak of the supreme realm, but the most terrifying thing about her was her strength of the northern wind. As expected of one of the top elements of the War of the Holy Saints. Although it was inferior, it was not inferior to the elements of the few world bosses that he had seen in the past. This can't go on, Brando thought to himself. The power of the north wind was too powerful. If this continued, he would probably be frozen in a few seconds. Gritting his teeth, Brando slightly sobered up. He focused his eyes and looked at an open space in the forest a few hundred feet away. He was ready to activate his space element to teleport himself there. Golden lines of law flashed in his eyes. He was about to find the correct order of law, but suddenly, a majestic force fell from the sky and pressed down on him. Brando was caught off guard and the space element was interrupted on the spot. The power of the element instantly backfired. If he had not reacted quickly, he would have been seriously injured on the spot. However, even so, he was still not in a good condition. He groaned and his face turned pale. The connection with the element was forcibly cut off. This was definitely the power of the extreme planes. To the supreme realm swordsmen and wizards, they were like the giant Antaeus standing on the earth. They could obtain endless power from it. That was why the extreme planes had the term domain. It was almost impossible to defeat a supreme realm expert in an individual's domain. Therefore, in a battle above the supreme realm, the stronger side would often use their own domain to defeat the other side's domain. When the realm suppression was too great, the stronger side could even use their domain to forcibly cut off the other side's connection with the lower realm. There was definitely more than one person on this battlefield who could absolutely suppress him. However, there were only a few people in the entire empire who could cut off his connection with his elements without pulling him into the extreme planes and using the power of a limiter to such a degree. Brando raised his head with some effort and saw Royale's right palm in the air. In the air, Vala could not help but shake his head. Mephistopheles told him not to worry about Brando. He was really curious about where the Ash Sword Saint's confidence in his student came from. After all, Brando was facing not just one, but several people at the peak of the Empire's power pyramid. Vala was slightly disappointed when he saw that Royale and the Witch Queen had teamed up to stop Brando. However, this result was not unexpected. Even with the Holy Flaming Blade, the difference in power was obvious. If 7 or 8 Supreme Realm experts were to let a junior escape under their noses, how could the Empire's reputation be? He was not surprised. He raised his hand and the golden flame sacred rune flashed in his hand. He was about to help Brando out, but as soon as he moved, Saipan and Richard appeared in front of him again. The flame sacred knight's grand commander's long golden hair danced in the wind like an angry lion. The sword in his hand shone brightly, and like a meteor streaking across the sky, the golden flame of the sword pierced towards the golden flame sacred rune in front of Vala. Although Saipan did not immediately make a move, the meaning in his eyes was very obvious. "Your Excellency, your opponent is here." Vala was helpless. If it was only Richard, he would not be able to do anything to him. However, Saipan's covetous eyes made him feel even more troubled. With a flick of his finger, the golden flame sacred rune in front of him disappeared, and a golden shield appeared on his body. The golden sword slashed accurately on the shield, and in an instant half of the sky shone as bright as day. Thunder continued to rumble on the mountain where the Frost Dew Manor was located. At this moment, the brilliance of the sword and magic intertwined. The entire Empire's capital had long known that there might be an elemental-level battle on the mountain, but no one dared to leave their houses to find out. The residents hid in their homes and looked through the windows at the crowd gathering on the streets with uneasy eyes. More and more people wearing cloaks and hiding their heads and tails gathered on the streets. Usually the patrolling cavalry would have dispersed them, but today was a little strange. Until now, the city guards and patrolling cavalry were nowhere to be seen. It was as if the empire's control over its heart had quietly disappeared. Silent uneasiness pervaded the entire imperial capital, and countless people could not sleep at night. In the frost-covered forest, the ice creaked along Brando's knees and spread to his waist. He could almost feel the strange tingling of his blood freezing in his lower body. The Witch King looked at him in midair. She was a rather beautiful middle-aged woman, but her eyes were like rolling mercury balls. Neither the white of her eyes nor the pupils could be seen. They were gray and silver, making her look very cold. She looked at Brando with a cold look and said, "The Dark Dragon?" It was not difficult for Brando to hear the mockery in her voice, but his expression did not change. He frowned as if he was thinking of a way to escape. He maintained this posture for a few breaths, and the ice continued to climb along his waist, covering his chest in the blink of an eye. But it was at this time that Royal, who stretched out his right hand to cover Brando, suddenly frowned and subconsciously looked in the direction of the Marigold commercial district. The Witch King's expression changed instantly. It was at this moment. Brando, who was frozen by the north wind, suddenly collapsed like an ice sculpture and turned into snowflakes that scattered in the air. These snowflakes dissipated before they fell to the ground. Ice break. Atatrice looked at the Witch King subconsciously. If she did not know that it was impossible, she would have thought that the Witch King was in cahoots with Brando. The Witch King was tricked by an elementalist's third circle illusion. The Witch King's expression was gloomy. Chase. She only said one word, but Royal, who was not far away, added, "Stop his men. His escape method is a little strange. Icebreak is just a trick." Atatrice looked back. Because their main target was Brando, they did not care where the Shire and the two little bloodline ran to. However, the Flame family knights surrounded them in the forest, so there was no need to worry about them flying out of the encirclement. However, the moment she saw the young adept servant, she could only watch as his figure slowly faded away in the forest. Finally he vanished into nothingness. Atatrice felt her hair stand on end when she saw this strange scene. In Wand there were many kinds of magic and elemental powers, but the way the young wizard servant disappeared in front of her eyes did not belong to any of them. It was neither invisibility nor illusion. Atatrice did not even feel the slightest fluctuation of magic. The lines of law on the other side of the world were as calm as ever, and there was no trace of elemental power left behind. It felt as if a person had disappeared into thin air in front of her eyes. As a witch, the mistress of the Lonely Hill, Atatrice had a strange thought at this moment. A ghost? She looked in another direction, and saw Andrique and Mephistopheles disappear into the forest in the same way. Almost all the Flame family knights surrounding them were stunned. "He's at the edge of the Marigold business district." Royal's eyes flashed and he finally confirmed his guess. "It's not magic. It's also not witchcraft." The Witch King replied with a gloomy face. "I also didn't feel any trace of elemental power." The youngest girl replied with a smile. After that, Royal and the Witch King could not help but fall silent. If it was not magic, nor was it the power of elemental power, nor did it borrow the power of the witch's dreams, then what kind of power was this? The key point was that they could not detect this kind of method. In other words, this kind of power was beyond their understanding. "I seem to have heard of such power before." After a moment of silence, Royal suddenly frowned and replied. "But," the Witch King's eyes flashed and she did not say a word. She had also heard of such power. But that was a story that belonged to a distant era. The person who once had it had a title that was unprecedented in history. He was called the Dark Dragon by the world. Vara, who witnessed this scene in the distance, could not help but have a flash of light in his eyes. He did not expect this little guy to really give him a surprise. Unlike anyone else present, he clearly recognized the source of Brando's power. Planeswalker, they really came back again. Mephisto's student was really amazing. He slowly stopped, and a beam of light broke through the dark clouds and descended from the sky. It actually made Richard and Saipan, who were fighting against him, unable to move. Sanctuary of Holy Words. There were several exclamations from below. Richard and Saipan were fixed in the flawless golden light, glaring at Vara. In the distance, Royal subconsciously wanted to attack, but after glancing at the golden light all over the sky, he shook his head and retracted his footsteps. Holy Word Shelter was the top holy spell of the Holy Cathedral of Fire, which could not be learned by anyone other than the Holy See. It was also the strongest life-saving method above the Holy See. Within the range of Holy Word shelter, if Vala wanted to leave, no one in Vaunt could stop him except the sage. Thinking back, Sydney used this spell to escape from the capital. At that time Richard and others could not do anything to her, let alone Vara himself. At this moment, Vara's figure was fading in a golden light. He finally looked at the dark night sky and shook his head. The Empire is no longer the same as before, Your Majesty. Teacher, are you also going to betray the Empire and stand in the position of others to fight against me? The Silver Queen's voice calmed down, as if she was not angry at Brando and others for escaping. Vara sighed. In the time of the princess, he was indeed one of the many teachers of the Silver Queen. At that time, the little princess' talent in the way of the golden flames had amazed everyone. If she were not a member of the royal family, she would have probably surpassed Sydney to become the next Holy See of the Holy Cathedral of Fire. You were once the kindest princess of Cruz, Vara sighed. If you are willing to return to the right path. I have never been more convinced that I am on the right path than I am now. The Silver Queen replied coldly. Bigotry has blocked your vision, Your Majesty. On the contrary, it is you who cannot see the road ahead. Vara shook his head, and his figure turned into a golden shadow. Finally the clouds closed, and the golden light only existed in the memory of the people present. As if everything that had happened before was just an illusion, only a long sigh echoed over the forest. The Silver Queen did not speak for a long time. The supreme class masters above the forest subconsciously looked at the night sky. Everyone more or less felt a little uncomfortable. 7 or 8 supreme class masters came together, but they could not even stop a young man at the peak of the law. What made them feel most ashamed was that not only did they not stop the other party, but they also let the other party escape unscathed after turning the Frost Dew Manor upside down. Among all the people present, the Witch Queen's face was the gloomiest, followed by Willick and the injured Bradley. Royer, who had failed in the end, looked calm. After a moment of silence, the Silver Queen's order came again. No need to chase, return to the White Rose Garden immediately. Chapter 1075. Mulberry Castle was located on the shores of a small lake called Hazeroy to the west of Rushta. At the turn of summer and autumn, the surface of the lake reflected the castle and the distant horizon. The snowline of the Hazeroy Mountains was a stark contrast against the tall forests and white maple trees. It was one of the most famous scenic spots near the imperial capital, but it was also a royal garden. However, the imperial family did not often stay here. They would only spend the long summer here to avoid the heat. After the Silver Queen, Constance, ascended to the throne, the castle was used even less frequently. She might not even visit it once in 2 or 3 years. Even if she did visit, she would only stay for less than a month. Even so, there were still groups of servants and imperial guards stationed in the castle. Half a month ago, a group of mountain maidservants had been replaced in Mulberry Castle. In addition, the Flaming Blade Knight Regiment had swapped in with the imperial guards. This made the castle much livelier. But tonight, this ancient and elegant castle by the lakeside was unusually quiet. The silver moon, Timmy's, moved slowly above the nearby forest. The white maple's shadow extended forward with the moonlight, crossing the fence and the forest path, leaving a shadow on the castle walls. The wind pushed the clouds above the night sky. A moment later, the shadow on the castle walls began to move and rise from the ground. It gradually formed into a woman dressed as a witch with a veil draped over her face. The woman stood by the battlements for a moment and looked into the courtyard in confusion. The courtyard was pitch black and there were no lights in the stables. There were no hidden sentries or patrolling guards on the castle walls. Normally, the servants would be asleep at this time. However, the castle would at least have a minimum amount of defensive power. It would not be as silent as it was now. She frowned and walked to the edge of the castle walls. The moonlight pouring down from the clouds seemed to materialize under her feet, forming a flight of stairs. She walked down the stairs and arrived at the courtyard. A faint silver radiance spread out in all directions from her body, sweeping across the entire castle in the blink of an eye. The woman raised an eyebrow as if she had realized something. However, it was at this moment that she suddenly looked back in the direction she had come from. She seemed to have heard something and was about to leave, but it was at this time that a trace of anger flashed in her eyes. She raised her right hand, and a crystal ball the size of a palm suddenly appeared in her palm. Several images were constantly changing on it, like flickering lights and passing shadows. If it was an ordinary person, they would not be able to see it clearly, but she could engrave one of the images in her eyes in the blink of an eye. If Brando was here, he would definitely recognize that it was the scene inside the Cat and Beard Inn. The woman raised her hand, and the crystal ball in her hand instantly turned into silver dust. Her body also shattered like broken glass, melting into the moonlight in the blink of an eye. As soon as the woman left, a few small black shadows landed lightly on the city wall behind her. They were cats. The black cat at the front had a big bow tied around its neck. It looked around curiously, and when it opened its mouth, it spoke in the characteristic sweet voice of Sugar Pot. "Strange, why is there no one? Even if the knight regiment has been led away by the Lord, there should at least be guards in the castle, right?" Behind the black cat, a yellow and white striped cat suddenly showed a nervous expression when it heard this. It hurriedly reminded her softly, "Shoo, lower your voice, Mississippi. It's good that there's no one here. Do you want to attract everyone here?" "Babasha, what are you afraid of? Haven't we confirmed that the Knight of the Sword of the Flame has already left, either to support the Lord's battle, or to deal with those strange guys in the city? Anyway, they won't be here. The rest of the guys combined are no match for me. Miss, it's better to be safe than sorry. It's better to be careful." Babasha looked around nervously. "This is the Empire. Don't forget that Atatrice and the others are here too." "There's no one here." Sugar Pot, who had turned into a black cat, glanced at the castle immersed in darkness indifferently. She raised her head, sniffed around with her nose and wondered, "But there's a strange smell in the air. It seems that someone of our kind has been here. Strange, I'm not sure. Does that woman have such a powerful guy under her command? Could it be the Witch Queen?" Babasha was startled. "That woman can't be here." "Well," Sugar Pot nodded, "it's really not her scent. Strange, is there such a powerful guy in our generation of witches? Let's get down to business, miss." Sugar Pot jumped down from the city wall and landed steadily on the meadow in the courtyard, just like a real cat. It didn't make the slightest sound. Behind her, including Babasha, the three witches who had turned into cats also jumped down one after another. They walked around the courtyard but found no one. "There's no one here, miss." The one who spoke was the white cat behind Babasha. Although it looked the smallest, it spoke with the voice of a middle-aged woman. "That woman is really unreliable. Be careful, miss, this may be a trap." Hearing the word trap, Babasha's hair stood on end. She subconsciously looked back, but the courtyard was as quiet as before. "Relax, Babasha, even if there's a trap, it's for the Lord. The Silver Queen has no interest in an old woman like you." "Miss," the white cat who spoke earlier suddenly spoke again, "there's someone in the castle." Sugar Pot nodded. She also noticed it, front left, third room. She walked elegantly like a cat to the window of the room. With a light jump, she jumped onto the windowsill and reached out her claws to fiddle with it twice. She opened the window a crack, and a strong smell of alcohol immediately wafted out. "That's why I hate drunkards." Hobbs Barak was indeed a drunkard. He was a dwarf from Ambrose. He was addicted to alcohol, but he was also the best horse trainer in the entire empire. The royal family hired him to be the equestrian master of Mulberry Castle, but he dared not drink on normal days. No matter how careless the dwarves were, they would never dare to ignore the strict rules of the royal family. Moreover, he cherished the current job very much. Not to mention how rich the collection in Her Majesty's stable was, just his identity as the strongest royal horse trainer of the empire was enough to make him feel extremely proud. But today was an exception. The royal guards were replaced by the Knights of the Sword of Fire. The servants in the castle were also transferred earlier. He had to help take care of the knights' horses, so he was left behind. As a result, a few hours ago the knights also left. Now he was the master of this empty castle. He did not dare to touch the royal wine cellar in the basement, but there were a few barrels of fine wine stored in the kitchen. Although they were not as good as the royal collection, they were enough to satisfy his craving for alcohol. He lay on a few bags of flour in a daze. He could not remember how much wine he had drunk. It seemed that there was a small barrel of dwarf liquor, then 3 bottles of Landfair liqueur and a bottle of whiskey. The alcohol seemed to form a thick cloud and wrapped him in it. Hobbs Barak burped. This was the life he was pursuing. He had a dream in a daze. He dreamt that he had earned enough money and returned to his hometown to build an unparalleled wine cellar. There were all kinds of rare wines in the cellar, from the Griffin's Feather in 1936 to the famous Cold Moon wine. This wine was produced in the year of the Cold Moon and was almost destroyed by a snowstorm in the winter of that year. However, because of this, it had a unique cold taste. It was the top collection of every royal family and aristocratic family. He dreamt that he had invited guests to a banquet. There were famous drinkers as well as people of noble upper-class society. On the long table covered with white cloth, there were all kinds of silver plates, piled with famous wines and colorful fruits and vegetables from all over the world. A black cat with a bow on its head was walking back and forth in the middle of the table. Hobbs Barak was stunned for a moment. He almost thought that he was seeing things. Why was there a black cat on the table? He could not help but rub his eyes subconsciously. It turned out that there was not only one cat on the table, but also two white cats and a tabby cat. He could not help but sit up. He was about to be furious at the servants in his dream, but before he could say anything, he saw the black cat talking to him. Hobbs Barak, the black cat stretched out its paw and fanned in front of his nose. It said with a look of disgust, "Damn drunkard, I'll give you a few words or I'll send you to hell." The dwarf trainer's eyes widened. The cat actually spoke human language. He shook his head and thought that he was indeed dreaming. But a moment later he suddenly woke up. Everything in the dream had turned into bubbles, and the surrounding environment had turned into a pitch-black kitchen. The narrow space was filled with the strong smell of alcohol and raw meat. On the wooden table directly opposite him, there were exactly 4 cats standing there. Among them, the black cat was the leader, and it was staring at him with eyes that were emitting a dim light in the dark. "Ghost!" The dwarf shrieked in fright, his legs kicking wildly as he crawled backwards. With a bang he crashed into the water bucket behind him. A series of rustling noises came from above his head, and the various spice jars that were originally placed on the shelf immediately toppled over, smashing into his head and face. "Ha!" Sugarpot could not help but laugh at this guy's stupidity. But she quickly put on a straight face and said, "Hobbs Bar, did you hear what I said?" The witch was good at controlling dreams. She had already known the name of the other party in the dream. However, the dwarf trainer was so scared that he broke out in a cold sweat. It was not a good sign to meet a black cat in the middle of the night in Wonde. Some legends in the countryside often believed that black cats, like crows, were the messengers of death. Moreover, these animals that brought bad luck were often associated with the witches, which was even worse. Hobbs Barak did not know that the people in front of him were the witches, but he was extremely frightened. He thought of the black cat's words and thought that it was really the messengers of death who came to send him to hell. Did he drink himself to death? He could not help but feel sad. The sad thing was that he had not drunk enough. "Let me ask you a question." Sugarpot did not care what he was thinking. Her eyes were shining with a charming light as if it could make people fall into a dream. "Where is the mistress of this place?" "St. Contic Palace, White Rose Garden." 2 rows of knights slowly stopped outside the gate of the Rose Garden. It was very quiet at night. There was not a single person on the Imperial Avenue. Rows of oak trees stood on both sides of the avenue, casting dark shadows on the ground. Outside this solemn palace was a large open meadow. There were no other buildings within a few hundred meters. It was all the royal gardens. But the knight's visit in the middle of the night still woke up the residents in the distant streets. The citizens secretly looked in the direction of St. Contic Palace through the window under the cold moonlight. From afar, they could see that these knights in black armor were not the Imperial Army, nor were they the Knights of the Holy Cathedral. Which Duke's Guards were they? Why did they come so late? And in St. Contic Palace, there was also a gaze that fell on these knights' body. Constance could clearly see the situation in the Rose Garden and the Imperial Avenue from the French arched window in her study. She sat behind her desk. The light from the crystal ball beside her hand had long since faded. She could no longer see the scenery of the forest near the Frost-Dew Manor. It had become dark, and a sliver of moonlight was reflected at the edges. There was no one in the room at this moment. Only the Dragon Queen stood silently in the darkness. She did not speak. Her Majesty the Queen did not speak either. Her gaze passed through the glass of the window and looked at the tightly guarded black carriage between the 2 rows of knight. She watched as the carriage door was opened by a knight. A maid alighted from the carriage. She had fiery red hair and bronze skin, the typical characteristics of the mountain people. After the maid alighted, she bowed slightly and then helped a well-dressed princess down. That was her countess. Only then did the Silver Queen reveal a proud expression. "When will our prince arrive?" she asked. "He's on his way, Your Majesty," the Dragon Queen replied in the darkness. The officials had been waiting in the hall for a long time. After a while she said, "Your Majesty." "It's fine," the Silver Queen replied. "Let me be alone for a while, Gwendolyn." The Dragon Queen nodded but did not move. "Those rats are making quite a ruckus today." "Yes, I just asked. The city guards have been drawn over by the battle over there." "Then go tell my dear Knight Commander what he should do now." The Dragon Queen nodded. "Go, come back before the main course." That's the theme of today's banquet. Only then did the Dragon Queen's figure retreat into the darkness. Then came the sound of the door opening. Finally there was a click and all the sounds turned into silence. Constance silently looked at the night scenery outside the window, not saying a word. You were once the kindest princess in Cruz. If you are willing to return to the right path. I have never been more certain that I am on the right path than I am now. Bigotry has clouded your vision, Your Majesty. On the contrary, you are the ones who cannot see the path ahead. An illusion seemed to extend before her eyes. Chapter 1076. The wind blew through the wilderness of the Four Realms. It was the sea breeze from the Silver Bay, or the summer breeze from the White Mountain. The airflow flowed over the sky, pushing the cotton-like clouds slowly towards the north. At the place closest to the skyline, the clouds were like a goddess, reaching out from the clouds to touch the rolling hills in the distance. When the wind blew over the hills, the meadow rose and fell in turn, forming stripes of different shades. The forest was located in the south of the Yundan area, like a dark green shadow, mixed with many tree species such as the thick-leaved maple and Elson black pine. The gray and white trunks were hidden in the shadows like toothpicks. The forest and the alfalfa tributaries under the low river bank formed a clear boundary. To the east was the kingdom of the elves, across the river from the allied forces of the Holy Cathedral of Fire. Mr. Darius, have you ever seen such a magnificent scenery in your hometown? The wilderness of the Four Realms is unique in Wonde. In terms of magnificence, even the White Plains cannot compare to it, Your Highness. The general on the horse looked at the horizon, trying to find traces of the elves' movements, but to no avail. The Alkash Mountains hung down from the sky like a shadow, the clouds on Whistling Peak did not disperse all year round, and a few eagles soared in the sky. He looked back at the Princess of the Empire. His face was chiseled, full of fortitude and vaguely similar to Brando, but his lips were thinner, and his brow was deeper, full of the characteristics of the Highlanders. A pair of brown eyes were bright, as if they could not support the strong will of their owner. But Erewhon has its own beauty, just like the Empire, the mountains of Cherepet, the pine needles of Elson, and the ruins of the high towers on the highlands. I understand, Erewhon is the only place of civilization and order created by the sages after the year of the return of glory. There is no more glorious land than it. Its people are hard-working and brave, and the nobles who lead them are excellent and glorious. The princess looked at the knight beside her without blinking. You flatter me. The princess smiled slightly, then turned her gaze to the horizon, her eyes as gentle as water. That is the kingdom of the elves. The wind elves turn their eyes to the north after the summer. They do not seem to intend to fight with us in the wilderness of the Four Realms. Perhaps they will enter the mountains. Before and for a long time after the War of the Holy Saints, the four sages, Gretel, Saint Tassol, Fanzan and Alanta, were close to each other, but now we see each other as enemies. Is that why Your Highness is fighting for peace in the Empire? Yes, but this holy war is too tragic. Who knows how long it will take to wash away all the blood that has been spilled? But I know in my heart that there is nothing wrong with killing each other in order to compete for living space. From my point of view, I cannot blame my country and allies. It is the same for the elves. The sages once expanded the territory, but since the end of the Age of Chaos, the knight who pioneered the land almost disappeared. It is not because people are stubborn but because the power of order is declining. The fire produced every year is less and less, and it is not enough to replace the fire that is about to die of old age. The Parliament of Nobles even legislated to limit the number of new territories each year, in order to prevent the mature lands of order from declining because of lack of replenishment. The princess said softly, but we cannot tell the people this for fear of causing panic. What should we say? Should we tell them that Lady Martha is abandoning us? Last month, my teacher Vala and the Great Holy See discovered that someone in the upper echelons of the Holy Cathedral had joined All for One. Although it was only an archbishop, the meaning behind it is disturbing. It shows that our faith is declining and people are becoming more and more confused. If this trend is not stopped, the consequences will be unimaginable. The general listened quietly. I have a plan. I hope to go to Saint Tassol and Fanzan after this holy war. On the one hand, it is to eliminate hatred. On the other hand, I believe that the Holy Cathedral of Fire is not the only one who is confused. All civilizations should have encountered the same trouble. 1,000 years ago we could form a sacred covenant and fight together for a goal. 1,000 years later we can do the same. If I cannot persuade the Holy Cathedral of Saint Tassol and Fanzan, then I will go to the Ring of the World and find a way to seek the approval of the Great Holy Sage. Lady Eloranta will stay to protect this world. She will not sit idly by. As the princess of the empire? The princess nodded. Mr. Darius, are you willing to be my knight? It would be an honor. The princess smiled knowingly. This is my dream, Mr. Darius. I have never told anyone. I hope that the 4 holy cathedrals can return to the era of glory. In the distant future we will open up a wider territory. The civil war between civilizations will thus be eliminated. I want to prove that what the 4 sages did was right. Once we succeed, people will no longer be confused. The general nodded thoughtfully. If such a day really comes, I will feel honored to be your knight, your highness. But it is difficult. We may not see it in our lifetime. It is difficult, but there will always be successors. No matter how lofty the ideal is, there will always be a lack of people who will fight for it. The princess nodded. Constance looked at the face that seemed to be reflected in the mirror. She stood face to face with her. The soft face was full of kindness and persistence. The light silver eyes flashed with longing and hope for the future. But there was not only naivety in them, but also a strong and indomitable will. That face was both familiar and strange to her. Her face was pale, and the muscles on her face were tense, as stiff as stone. Enough. She growled in a low voice, her hands clutching her hair so tightly that her knuckles protruded like ghost claws. The scene became fragmented and blended into the darkness of the study. The heavy curtains reflected the lights of the city in the distance. The tall bookcase stood quietly in the shadows. The desk was scattered with documents on parchment. The signatures on them seemed to be written in blood, and were extremely eye-catching in the dim light. Outside the study, Dragon Queen Gwendolyn silently withdrew her gaze and shook her head. This is fate. It is laughable and true but not worthy of pity. Because everyone has to face it and no one is more noble than anyone else. On the day of the destruction of Babel Tower, they also felt the same bone-piercing pain. She turned around and walked out of the corridor. In the guest hall, a knight had been waiting for a long time. He seemed to be restless. Gwendolyn took in his expression and replied, Her Majesty does not wish to receive guests for the time being. She has entrusted me with full authority to handle emergencies on her behalf. Speak, what is it? My lady, please forgive us for not being able to contact Marquis Baroque. Before he left at noon yesterday, he sent Her Majesty an order to strictly order the city guards of Ginkgo Castle to leave their garrisons. However, before evening, our informants sent news that the cultists are inciting riots in the city. Now, thousands of people have gathered in the Marigold Commercial District and Silver Horse Square. If they are not stopped in time, the consequences will be unimaginable. Is this news before you left the garrisons, or is this the latest news? Before I left the garrisons, my lady? How much time has it been? Half an hour. What about the patrolling knights? I do not know, my lady. I did not see them on the way here. That is good. The knight was slightly stunned. He looked up and saw the countess in front of him, Gwendolyn's identity on the surface. A strange smile appeared on his face. Before he could react, his consciousness was shrouded in endless darkness. Gwendolyn looked coldly at the corpse on the floor. The young man had died with his eyes wide open on the carpet. His head and headless body were on each side of the carpet. The blood showed a dark color in the darkness. The shadow of the corpse wriggled as if it was alive, and in a moment, it was reduced to nothingness. Marquis Baroque won't give you any orders, but you won't be able to hear it anyway, she muttered to herself as she looked at the hole in the carpet. Marquis Baroque won't give you any orders. Her figure slowly melted into the darkness. The scenery before Brando's eyes changed rapidly. The forest was pulled behind him faster than the speed of light. Oak trees, goosefoot grasses, and heather were hidden under the rocks. Due to the speed, the trunks and leaves were almost connected into a straight line, to the point where they were indistinguishable from each other. It was as if they had flowed into a color plate and mixed together. Then a speck of light appeared in front of him. The speck of light arrived in front of him in an instant. The scenery within extended and expanded, turning into a quiet night scene on the east bank of the Marigold River. The river glistened under the moonlight, and an ancient bridge spanned the waterway between Cold Dew Forest and the commercial district. The rows upon rows of roofs in the city gave off a faint silver light in the distance. Brando was stunned for a moment before he realized that he was already at the foot of the mountain of Cold Dew Manor. My lord. Brando turned around and saw Medisha and Hippamera by her side. He did not speak but immediately waved his hand. Several doors of light opened in the air, and the Shire and Mephistopheles fell out one by one. Finally, Andrique landed heavily on the female vampire. Ugh! Andrique used her hand to push herself up from her brother's body, pressing the latter's head into the mud at the same time. She did not even look at the latter. Patting the dust off her skirt, she silently took a few steps away from the riverside. Although bloodkin were not as afraid of water as the legend said, they did not seem to like it that much either. Brando looked at Mephistopheles, who got up from the ground and wiped the mud off their faces with their hands. He could not help but shake his head helplessly. Although the card had turned Mephistopheles and Andrique into twins, the latter did not always seem to admit it. Hippamera also glared at Andrique and walked over to help Mephistopheles wipe their faces clean. The priestess was known for her kindness in the Abbey's domain. Although she liked to keep some strange animals, which made it difficult for people to get close to her. "My lord," Medisha breathed a sigh of relief and asked with some concern, "the battle just now?" "There was a small accident." "Where is Sydney?" "This should be the edge of Marigold's commercial district. Nearby is the 12 Fingers Alley, and the patrolling cavalry's headquarters is located at the junction between here and the Queen's district." "That's right," Brendel asked as he observed the surroundings. The river bank and forest quickly formed an impression in his mind. "Lady Sydney and His Excellency the Legion Commander left before us. Did they not arrive? It seems that they have been intercepted. Except for Royale Saipan and the other supreme beings, Cruz did have the strength to do this," Brando thought to himself. "The Silver Queen is not completely defenseless." He replied, "There's no need to wait for them. Sydney and Lady Veronica have their own ways to escape. I don't know when the Silver Queen will catch up. Although the ability of a planeswalker should be able to confuse them for a moment, Royer and Saipan are the top wizards in Kurlutz. They must have their own ways to detect the direction of my escape." He looked at the west bank of the Marigold River. "We will go along the canal between the Marigold Business District and the Queen's District. After we reach the King Street, we will go directly to the west of Rustle. Although that is where the patrol cavalry headquarters is located, the cultists are inciting riots in the city. If I'm not mistaken, the city guards and the patrol cavalry should be attracted to them. This route is actually safer." "My lord." Brando turned around and asked, "What's wrong, Medisha? Do you have anything to add?" The Silver Elf Princess frowned and hesitated for a moment. She seemed to want to say something. But she finally made up her mind and said, "We met Andesha earlier." "Oh." Brando was stunned. "Andesha, she? Did she attack you?" Medisha shook her head. "No, but she looked a little strange." "Have you heard of the second corruption, my lord?" "The second corruption? You mean she looked like she was injected with the blood of God for the second time?" Brando immediately reacted, "That's impossible unless she doesn't want to live anymore." Medisha could not help but look at her lord in surprise. Although the tree herders were no different from the members of All for One and the Sheep's Head cult in the eyes of ordinary people, few people knew that these former druids who called themselves the Withered Ones had been secretly studying the power of the blood of God for more than 10 centuries. Many people did not even understand what the blood of God was, and they confused it with the demonic sacrifice of the Sheep's Head cult. But Medisha knew that although the tree herders were extremely crazy, the blood of God in their hands was the real blood of God. It was not the demonic blood or the power from hell as the rumors said. However, not only did her lord have a clear understanding of the God's blood, he was also able to point out the nature of the secondary corruption. She couldn't help but be curious. How did he learn such obscure knowledge at such a young age? Brando did not know what the little princess was thinking. He only frowned deeply. It was not strange for Andesha to appear here. She was originally in the imperial capital. Perhaps the rioters had attacked the imperial prison, but the second corruption was somewhat unusual. I hope there is no connection between the two. He did not know why, but he felt a deep uneasiness in his heart. You're tuning in to the Han Lee's Wuxia Adventures YouTube channel. We're so grateful for your support, and don't forget to subscribe to join us on this incredible journey through captivating stories. Your generosity through donations truly makes a world of difference, as it's the primary source of revenue that allows me to expand and enhance this channel for you. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for being a part of this adventure.